Chapter 35 of The Victim, a Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis, by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 35, Suspicion. Jenny Barden had refused to listen to Captain Welford's accusation of treachery against her lover, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. It grew with such rapidity that her peace of mind was utterly destroyed. In vain she put the ugly thought aside. "It's impossible," she murmured 100 times, only to come back to the idea that would not down. Night after night she tossed in her pillow, unable to sleep. The longer she faced the problem of Socola's character and antecedents, the more probable became the truth of Dick's suspicions. She had made his present position in the State Department possible. Again her love rose in rebellion. "It's a lie," she sobbed. "I won't believe it. Dick's crazy jealousy's at the bottom of it all." Why had Socola buried himself in the Department of State so completely since the scene with Dick? His calls had been brief. Their relations had been strained in spite of her honest effort to put them back on the old footing. He gave as his excuse for not calling oftener the enormous pressure of work which the crisis of the invasion of Pennsylvania had brought to his office. The excuse was valid, but perfect love would find a way. It should need no excuse. There was something wrong. She realized it now with increasing agony. Unable to endure the strain, she sent for Socola. Their meeting was awkward. She made no effort to apologize or smooth things over. Her attitude was instinctive. She gave her feelings full rein. She fixed on him a steady, searching gaze. "It's useless for me to try to pretend, my love. There's something wrong between us." "Your mind has been poisoned," was the quick, serious answer. "Thoughts are things. They have the power to kill or give life. A poisonous idea has been planted in your soul. It's killing your love for me. I feel it, and I'm helpless." "You can cast it out," she answered tenderly. "How?" "Tell me frankly and honestly the whole story of your life." "You believe me an impostor?" "I love you." "And that is not enough?" "No. Make suspicion impossible. You can do this if you are as innocent as I believe you are." She paused, and a sob caught her voice. "Oh, my love, it's killing me. I can neither eat nor sleep. Show me that such a thing is impossible." He took her hand. "How foolish, my own, to ask this of me. We love, right or wrong. Love is the fulfillment of the law. You call me here to cross-examine me." No, dear heart. Just to have you soothe my fears and make me laugh again." "But how is it possible? Once this thought has found its way into your mind. If I am a spy, as your Captain Welford says, it is my business to deceive the enemy. I couldn't tell the truth and live in Richmond. I would swing from the nearest limb if I should be discovered." Jenny covered her face with her hands. Don't, please." "Can't you see how useless such a question?" "You can't convince me?" she asked pathetically. "I won't try," he said firmly. "You must trust because you love me. Nothing I could say could convince you." He paused and held her hands in a desperate clasp. "Trust me, dear. I promise in good time to convince you that I am all your heart has told you." "You must convince me now or I'll die," she sobbed. "You're asking the impossible." He stroked her hand with a tender touch, rose, and led her to the door. "You try to trust me?" There was an unreal sound in her voice as Jenny slowly replied, "Yes, I'll try." Socola hurried to the house on Church Hill and dispatched a courier on the mission of tragic importance. Kilpatrick and Dahlgren were preparing to capture Richmond by a daring raid of 3,000 cavalrymen. Jenny watched him go with the determination to know the truth at all hazards. End of Chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Victim, a Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis, by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 36. The Fatal Deed. The Battle of Gettysburg and the disaster of the fall of Vicksburg once more gave to the Johnston junta and the Confederate Congress their opportunity to harass the president. Their power for evil had been greatly diminished by the pressure of the swiftly moving tragedy of the war. The appearance of this Congress was curiously plain and uninteresting. With the exception of J.L.M. Curry of Alabama and Barksdale of Mississippi, there was not a man among them of constructive ability as a statesman. Foote of Tennessee was noted for his high-flown English, his endless harangue, and his elaborate historical illustrations. Had his ability been equal to the intensity of his hatred for Davis, he would have been a dangerous man to the administration. James Lyons of Virginia stood 6'3" in his stockings, had fine even white teeth, and was considered the handsomest man in the assembly. Yancey, the fierce, uncompromising agitator of secession, was too violent to command the influence to which his genius entitled him. Senator Barden, fierce, impatient, bombastic, had long ago exhausted the vocabulary of invective and could only repeat himself in descending anticlimax. Hill of Georgia was a young man of ability who gave promise of greater things under more favorable conditions. The real business of this Congress was transacted in the secret executive sessions. When the public was admitted, the people of Richmond generally looked on with contempt. They sneeringly referred to them as the College Debating Society on Capitol Hill. The surroundings of their halls added to the impression of inefficiency, dirty, dingy, and utterly lacking in the luxuries which the mind associates with the exercise of sovereign power. The Senate was forced to find quarters in the third story of the State House. There was no gallery, and the spectators were separated from the members by an improvised railing. The only difference noticeable between the senators and the spectators was that the members had seats and the listeners and loafers had standing room only behind the rail. The House of Representatives had a better chamber, but its walls were bare of ornament or paintings. Its chairs were uncushioned, its desks dingy and slashed with pocket knives. Its members sat with their heels in the air and their bodies sprawled in every conceivable attitude of ugly indifference. The heart and brains of the South were on the field of battle, her noblest sons destined to sleep in unmarked graves. The scenes of personal violence which disgraced the sittings of this nondescript body of lawmakers did much to relieve the president of the burden of their hostility. Foote of Tennessee provoked an encounter with Judge Dargan of Alabama, which came near a tragic ending. The judge was an old man of eccentric dress, much given to talking to himself, particularly as he wandered about the streets of Richmond. The gallery of the House loved him from the first for his funny habit of scratching his arm when the itch of eloquence attacked him, and always he addressed the speaker as Mr. Chairman. They loved him, particularly for that. The eccentric judge had a peculiarly fierce antipathy to Foote. Words of defiance had passed between them on more than one occasion. The House was in secret session. The judge was speaking. Foote was sitting near, glanced up at his enemy, and muttered, "Damned old scoundrel." The judge's gray head suddenly lifted. He snatched a bowie knife from his pocket and dashed for the man who had insulted him. From every direction rose the shouts and cries of the excited House. "Stop him! Hold him! Great God! Judge! Judge!" The wildest uproar followed. Half a dozen members threw themselves on the old man, dragged him to the floor, pinned him down, and wrestled the knife from his grasp. When the eloquent statesman from Tennessee saw that his assailant was disarmed and safely guarded by 6 stalwart men, he struck an attitude, expanded his chest, smote it with both hands, and exclaimed with melodramatic gusto, "I defy the steel of the assassin." The House burst into shouts of uncontrollable laughter and adjourned for the night. Another scene of more tragic violence occurred in the Senate, a hand-to-hand fight between William L. Yancey and Ben Hill. The senator from Georgia threw his antagonist across the desk, held him there in a grip of steel, and pounded his face until dragged away by his friends. Yancey's spine was wrenched in the struggle, and it was rumored that this injury caused his death. It possibly hastened the end already sure from age, disease, and careless living. Committees from the Assembly of lawmakers who attempted to instruct the conscientious, hard-working man of genius, the Southern people, had made their president found little comfort with their efforts. Davis received him with punctilious ceremony. His manners were always those of a gentleman, but he never allowed them to return to their onerous work in the debating society without a clear vision of his views. They were never expressed with violence, but the ice sometimes formed on window panes if he stood near without talking. A congressional committee was demanding the restoration of Beauregard to command. "General Beauregard has asked me to relieve him, gentlemen." "Only on furlough for illness," interrupted the chairman. "And you have forced him into retirement," added a member. The president rose, walked to the window, gazed out on the crowded street for a moment, and turned, suddenly confronting his tormentors. He spoke with quiet dignity, weighing each word with cold precision. If the whole world asked me to restore General Beauregard to the command which I have given to Braxton Bragg, I would refuse. He resumed his seat, and the committee retired to Senator Barton's house, where they found a sympathetic ear. Bragg was preparing to fight one of the greatest battles of the war. At Chickamauga, the River of Death, he encountered Rosecrans. At the end of 2 days of carnage, the Union Army was totally routed right, left, and center and hurled back from Georgia into Chattanooga. Polk's wing captured 28 pieces of artillery and Longstreet's 21. 8,000 prisoners of war were taken, 15,000 stands of arm, and 40 regimental colors. Rosecrans' army of 80,000 men were literally cut to pieces by Bragg's 50,000 Southerners. No more brilliant achievement of military genius illuminates history. Chickamauga was in every way as desperate a battle as Arcola, and in all Napoleon's Italian campaigns, nothing more daring and wonderful was accomplished by the man of destiny. Bragg had justified the faith of Davis. Rosecrans was hemmed in Chattanooga, his supplies cut off, and his army was facing starvation when he was relieved of his command, General Thomas succeeding him. Grant was hurried to Chattanooga with 2 army corps to raise the siege. With his reinforcements, Grant raised the siege, surprised and defeated Bragg's army, which had been weakened by the detachment of Longstreet's corps for a movement on Knoxville. Bragg withdrew his army then again into Georgia and resigned his command. The stern, irritable Confederate fighter was disgusted with the constant attacks on him by peanut politicians and refused to hear Davis's plea that he remain at the head of the Western Army. The president called on him to come to Richmond and made him his chief of staff. The disaster to the Confederacy at Chattanooga, which gave General Grant supreme command of the Union forces, brought to the Johnston junta at Richmond its opportunity to once more press their favorite to the front. Since his Vicksburg fiasco, the president had isolated him. Davis resisted this appointment with deep foreboding of its possible disaster to the South. In the midst of this bitter struggle over the selection of a Western field commander, the President of the Confederacy received the first and only recognition of his government accorded by any European power. His early education at the St. Thomas Monastery had given the Southern leader a lofty opinion of the Roman Catholic Church. Davis had always seen in the members of this faith in America friends who could not be alienated from the oppressed. Failing to receive recognition from the great powers of Europe, he dispatched his diplomatic representative to Rome with a carefully worded letter to the Pope, in which he expressed his gratitude to Pius IX for his efforts on behalf of peace. The Pope had urged his bishops in New Orleans and New York to strive to end the war. The Vatican received the Confederate diplomat with every mark of courtesy and every expression of respect according to the most powerful nations of the world. The Dominican friars had not forgotten the wistful, eager boy they had taught and loved in Kentucky. The Pope replied to this communication in an official letter which virtually recognized the Confederacy both in his capacity as a temporal sovereign and as the head of the Roman Catholic Church. The President read this letter with renewed hope of favorable actions abroad. Illustrious and honorable President, salutation. We have just received with all suitable welcome the person sent by you to place in our hands your letter dated 23rd of September last. Not slight was the pleasure we experienced when we learned from those persons and the letter with what feelings of joy and gratitude you were animated. Illustrious and honorable President, as soon as you were informed of our letters to the Venerable Brother John, Archbishop of New York, and John, Archbishop of New Orleans, dated the 18th of October last year, in which we have, with all of our strength, excited and exhorted these venerable brothers that in their episcopal piety and solicitude they should endeavor with the most ardent zeal and in our name to bring about the end of the fatal civil war which has broken out in those countries, in order that the American people may obtain peace and concord and dwell charitably together. It is particularly agreeable to us to see that you, illustrious and honorable President, and your good people are animated with the same desire of peace and tranquility which we have in our letters inculcated upon our venerable brothers. May it please God at the same time to make the other people of America and their ruler, reflecting seriously on how terrible is civil war and what calamities it engenders, listen to the inspiration of a calm spirit and adopt resolutely for the part of peace. As for us, we shall not cease to offer up the most fervent prayers to God Almighty that He may pour out upon all of the people of America the spirit of peace and charity, and that He will stop the great evils which afflict them. We at the same time beseech the God of pity to shed abroad upon you the light of His countenance, and attach you to us by a perfect friendship. Given at Rome, at St. Peter's, the 3rd of December, 1863, by our pontificate, Pope Pius IX. The dark hour was swiftly approaching when the South and her leader would need the prayers of all of God's saints. Failing to persuade Bragg to reconsider his resignation, Davis appointed General Hardee as his successor to command the Western Army. Hardee declared the responsibility was more than he could assume. Under the urgent necessity of driving the Union Army back from its position at Chattanooga, and heartsick with eternal wrangling of the opposition, Davis reluctantly ordered Joseph E. Johnston personally to assume command of the Army of Tennessee, and the fatal deed was done. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 37, The Raiders. In February 1864, both the North and the South were straining every nerve for the last act of the grand drama of blood and tears. The presidential election would be held in November to choose a successor to Abraham Lincoln. At this moment, Lincoln was the most unpopular, the most reviled, the most misunderstood, and the most abused man who had ever served as President of the United States. The opposition to him inside his own party was fierce, malignant, vindictive, and would stop short of nothing to encompass his defeat in their nominating convention. They had not hesitated even to accuse his wife of treason. Military success and military success alone would save the administration at Washington. George B. McClellan, the most popular general of the Union Army, was already slated to oppose Lincoln on a platform demanding peace. If the South could hold her own until the first Monday in November, the opposition to the war in the North would crush the administration, and peace would be had at the price of Southern independence. No man in America understood the tense situation more clearly than Jefferson Davis. His agents in the North kept him personally informed of every movement of the political chessboard. Personally, he had never believed in the possibility of the South winning in a conflict of arms since the death of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson's death had been given its full significance at the Battle of Gettysburg. He had, however, believed in the possibility of the party of the North, which stood for the old Constitution, winning an election on the issue of a bloody and unsuccessful war, and on their winning, that he could open negotiations for peace and gain every point for which the war had been fought. It all depended on the battles of the coming spring and summer. Grant, the new commander-in-chief of the armies of the Union, had been given a free hand with unlimited resources of men and money. He was now directing the movements of nearly 1 million soldiers in blue. Sherman was drilling under his orders an army of 100,000 with which to march into Georgia, while Grant himself would direct the movement of 250,000 men in his invasion of Virginia. The Confederate president saw at once that Lee's army must be raised to its highest point of efficiency, and that it should be of equal importance that Joseph E. Johnston should be given as many or more men with which to oppose Sherman. To allow for Johnston's feeble strategy, Davis sent him 68,000 soldiers to Dalton, Georgia, to meet Sherman's 100,000, and gave Lee 64,000, which to oppose Grant's 150,000, threatening to cross the Rapidan and move directly on Richmond. Sokola had informed the War Department at Washington that the Confederate capital had been stripped of any semblance of an effective garrison to fill the ranks of Lee and Johnston. General Judson Kilpatrick was authorized to select 3,000 picked cavalry dashed suddenly on Richmond, captured and released the 15,000 Union prisoners confined in its walls and stockades. These prisoners Grant steadily refused to receive in exchange. In vain, Davis besought the federal government to take them home in return for an equal number of Confederate prisoners who were freezing and dying in the North. Grant's logic was inexorable. Every Confederate prisoner exchanged and sent back home meant a recruit to Lee's army. It was cruel to leave his men to languish in beleaguered Richmond, whose citizens were rioting in the streets for bread, but he figured these prisoners as soldiers dying in battle. The Confederate government had no medicine for them. The blockade was drawn so tight scarcely an ounce of medicine could be obtained for the Confederate army. Davis offered the Washington government to let their own surgeons to come to Richmond and carry medicine and food to their prisoners. His request was refused. The only thing Grant conceded was his consent to Kilpatrick's attempt to free and arm these 15,000 prisoners and loose them with fire and sword in the streets of the Confederate capital. Little did the men, women, and children of Richmond dream that they were lying down each night to sleep on the thin crust of a volcano. Captain Welford, in the pursuit of Sokola and Miss Van Loo, had found that the woman on Church Hill persisted in her visits to the prison. Libby, which contained a number of Union officers in rank, was her favorite. On the last day of February, his patient watch was rewarded. He had placed a spy in Libby disguised as a captive Union soldier. This man had sent the captain an urgent message to communicate with him at once. Within 30 minutes, Welford confronted him in the guard room of the prison. The captain spoke in sharp, nervous terms. "Well, I have something big." He paused and glanced about the room. "Go on." "There's a plot on foot inside to escape." "Of course, they're always plotting to escape. We've got no real prison system, no discipline. Hundreds have escaped already. It's nothing new." "This is new," the spy went on eagerly. "They let me into their councils last night. There's going to be a big raid on Richmond. The men inside are going to fight their way out, arm themselves, and burn the city. When they get the signal from the outside, they'll batter down the walls and rush through." "Batter down the walls?" "Yes, sir." "How?" "They've loosed 2 big rafters and have them ready to use as battering rams." "You're sure of this?" "Sure God's in heaven. Go see for yourself." Captain Welford gave a low whistle. "This is big news. There are enough prisoners in Richmond to make an army corps. 1,100 in here, 2,500 at Crewe and Pemberton's at Belle Isle, and the other stockades at least 15,000 in all. They're guarded by a handful of men. If they realize their power, they can batter their way out in 5 minutes and sweep the city with blood and fire." He stopped suddenly, drew a deep breath, and turned again to the man. "That'll do for you here. Take a little rest. You'd as well go back to the lion's den when they find out what I know. They'd spot you sure and tear you limb from limb." The spy saluted. "Report to me in a week from today at the office. You've earned a vacation." The man saluted again and passed quickly out. Captain Welford asked the superintendent to call his prisoners together. "I have something to say to them." 1,000 silent men in blue were gathered in the assembly room of the old warehouse. Captain Welford boldly entered the room, carrying a box in his hand. He placed it on the floor, sprang on it, and lifted his hand over the crowd. "I have an announcement to make, gentlemen," he began quietly, amid a silence that was deathlike. "Department which I represent has learned that you are planning to batter down the walls and join a force of raiders who are on their way to capture Richmond." He paused, and a murmur of smothered despair, inarticulate, bitter, crept through the crowd. "Forestall this little scheme. I've planted 1,000 pounds of powder under this building. I've a mind every other prison as well. The first one of you that lifts his finger to escape gives the signal that will blow you into eternity." Dick stepped from the box and made his way out without another word. He could feel the wild heartbeat of baffled hope as they followed him to the door with despairing eyes. A murmur of sickening rage swept the prison. An ominous silence fell where hope had beat high. The same strategic announcement was made in every prison in Richmond. No mines had been laid. But the story served its purpose. 15,000 men were bound hand and foot by fear. 300 soldiers guarded them successfully. Not a finger was lifted to help their bold rescuers who were already dashing towards the city. Colonel Uric Dahlgren was crossing the James above Richmond to strike from the south side, while General Kilpatrick led the attack directly from the north. Dahlgren's army crossed the river at Ely's Ford, passed in the rear of Lee's army, captured a Confederate court-martial in session, but missed a park of 68 pieces of artillery which had been left unguarded. When they again reached the James and Davis Mill, where a ford was supposed to be, none could be found. Stanton had sent from Washington a Negro guide. They accused the Negro of treachery and hung him from the nearest limb without the formality of a drumhead court-martial. At dawn on March 1st, Bradley T. Johnson's cavalry guarding Lee's flank struck one of Kilpatrick's parties and drove them on in the main body. They pursued Kilpatrick's men through Ashland and on down to the outer defenses of Richmond. Here the raiders dismounted their 2,500 men and prepared to attack the entrenchments. Wade Hampton immediately moved out to meet him. Bradley T. Johnson's Marylanders drew up in Kilpatrick's rear at the same moment and captured 5 men bearing dispatches from Dahlgren. He would attack on the rear at sunset. He asked Kilpatrick to strike at the same moment. Johnson boldly charged Kilpatrick's rear with his handful of men and drove them headlong down the peninsula to the York River. The Confederate leader had but 75 men and 2 pieces of artillery, but he hung on Kilpatrick's division of 2,500 and captured 140 prisoners. Dahlgren at night, with but 400 men, boldly attacked the defenses on the north side of the city. He was met by a company of Richmond boys under 18 years of age. The youngsters gave such good account of themselves that he withdrew from the field, leaving 40 of his men dead and wounded. In his retreat down the peninsula, he failed to find Kilpatrick's division. His command was cut to pieces and captured, and Dahlgren himself was killed. The part which Sokola had played in this raid was successfully accomplished without a hitch. He was compelled to answer the drum, which called every clerk of his department to arms for the defense of the city. In darkness he succeeded in pressing into Dahlgren's lines, and on his retreat made his way back to the place in the ranks of the Confederates. It was a little thing which betrayed him after the real danger was past and brought him face to face with Jenny Barton. End of Chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 38, The Discovery. From the moment Captain Welford had discovered the plot of the prisoners to cooperate with Kilpatrick and Dahlgren, he was morally sure that Miss Van Lew had been their messenger. He was equally sure that Sokola had been one of her accomplices. On the day of the announcement of his powder plant to the prisoners, he sent a guard to watch the house on Churchill and report to him the moment Crazy Bet should emerge. Within 2 hours, he received the message that she was on her way downtown, with her market basket swinging on her arms. Dick knew that this woman could not recognize him personally. He was only distantly related to the Welfords of Richmond. Miss Van Lew was in a nervous agony to deliver her dispatch to Kilpatrick, warning him that the purpose of the raid had been discovered and that he must act with the utmost caution. She had no scout at hand, and Kilpatrick's was expected at every moment at her rendezvous near the market. Dick turned the corner, circled a block, and met her. She was childishly swinging the basket on her arm and humming a song. She smiled vacantly into his face. He caught the look of shrewd intelligence and saw through her masquerade. A single word from her lips now would send her to the gallows, and certainly lead to Sokola's arrest. The captain was certain that she carried dispatches on her person at the moment. If he could only introduce her to drop them, the trick would be turned. He turned, retracted his steps, overtook her, and whispered as he passed, "Your trusted messenger." She paid no attention. There was not the slightest recognition, no surprise, no inquiry. Her thin face was the mask of death. Was this man Kilpatrick's scout, or was he a Secret Service man on her trail? The question seethed through her excited soul. Her life hung on the answer. It was a question of judgment of character and personality. The man was a stranger, but the need was terrible. Should she take the chance? She quickened her pace and passed Dick. Again she heard him whisper, "Your message is here. I'm going through tonight." In her hand, clasped tight, was her dispatch, torn into strips, and each strip rolled into a tiny ball. Should she commence to drop them one by one? Perplexed, she stopped and glanced back suddenly into Dick's face. Her decision was instantaneous. The subtle sixth sense had revealed in a flash of his eager eyes her mortal danger. She turned into a side street and hurried home. The captain was again baffled by a woman's wit. His disappointment was keen. He had hoped to prove his accusation to Jenny Barton before the sun set. She had ceased to fight his suspicions of Sokola. His name was not mentioned. She was watching her lover with more desperate earnestness than he was. The captain had failed to entrap the wily little woman with her market basket, but through her he struck the trail of the big quarry he had sought for 2 years. Sokola was imperiled by a woman's sentimental whim. This woman with nerves of steel and a heart whose very throb she could control by an indomitable will. Heartsick over her failure to get through the lines, her warning to Kilpatrick, she had felt responsibility for young Dahlgren's death. Womanlike, she determined, at the risk of her life and the life of every man she knew, to send the body of this boy back to his father in the North. In vain Sokola pleaded against this mad undertaking. The woman's soul had been roused by the pathetic figure of the daring young raider whose crutches were found strapped to his saddle. He had lost a leg but a few months before. He had been buried at the crossroads where he fell, the roads from Stevensville and Mantua Ferry. In pity for the sorrow of his disgruntled father, Davis had ordered the body disinterred and brought into Richmond. It was buried at night in a spot unknown to anyone save the Confederate authorities. Feeling had run so high on the discovery of the purpose of the raiders to burn the city that the Confederate president feared some shocking indignity might be offered the body. The night Miss Van Loo selected for her enterprise was cold and dark, and the rain fell in dismal, continuous drizzle. The grave had been discovered by a Negro who saw the soldiers bury the body. It was identified by the missing right leg. The work was done without interruption or discovery. Sokola placed the body in Rowley's wagon, which was filled with young peach trees concealing the casket. The pickets would be deceived by this simple device. Should one of them thrust his bayonet into the depths of those young trees, more than one neck would pay the penalty. But they wouldn't. He was sure of it. At the picket post, Rowley sat in stolid indifference while he heard the order to search his wagon. He engaged the guard in conversation. Wagons entered and passed, and still he talked lazily to his chosen friend. The lieutenant looked from his tent and yelled at last, "What the hell's the matter with you? Search that man, let him go." "It'd be a pity to tear up all them fine fruit trees," the guard said with a yawn. "I don't think you bother 'em," Rowley answered indifferently. "But I know a soldier's duty." Another wagon dashed up in a hurry. The guard examined him and he passed on. Again the lieutenant called, "Search that man, let him go." Rowley's face was a mask of lazy indifference. The guard glanced at him and spoke in low tones. "Your face is guarantee enough, partner. Go on." Sokola flanked the picket and joined Rowley. Near Hungary, on the farm of Oric the German, a grave was hurriedly dug and the casket placed in it. The woman helped to heap the dirt in and plant over it one of the peach trees. 3 days later, in response to a pitiful appeal from Dahlgren's father, Davis ordered the boy's body sent to Washington. The grave had been robbed. The sensation it created was second only to the raid itself. It was only too evident to the Secret Service of the Confederate government that an organization of federal spies honeycombed the city. The most desperate and determined efforts were put forth to unearth these conspirators. Captain Welford had made the discovery that the conspirators who had stolen Dahlgren's body had cut his curling blond hair and dispatched it to Washington. The bearer of this dispatch was a Negro. He had been thoroughly searched, but no incriminating papers were found. The captain had removed a lock of this peculiarly beautiful hair and allowed the messenger of love to go on his way, and determined to follow him on return to Richmond and locate his accomplices. Dick's report of this affair to Jenny had started a train of ideas which again centered on her suspicion of Sokola. The night this body had been stolen, she had sent for her lover in a fit of depression. The rain was pouring in cold, drizzling monotony. Her loneliness had become unbearable. He was not at home and could not be found. Alarmed and still more depressed, she sent her messenger 3 times. The last call he made was long past midnight. Her suspicion of his connection with the service of the enemy had become unendurable. She had not seen or heard from him since the effort to find him that night. He was at his desk at work as usual the next morning. She wrote him a note and begged that he call at once. He came within half an hour, a wistful smile lighting his face as he extended his hand. I am forgiven for having been born abroad. I have been sent for you. I have waited long. It's not the first time I've asked you to call, she cried in strange terms. No. She held his gaze with steady intensity. I sent for you the night young Dahlgren's body was stolen. Really? It was raining. I was horribly depressed. I couldn't endure the strain. I meant to surrender utterly and trust you. I didn't get the message. I know you didn't. Where were you? Engaged in important business for the government. What government? How can you ask such a question? I do ask it. I sent for you 3 times, the 3rd time after midnight. Wasn't very modest, perhaps. I was so miserable I didn't care. I just wanted to put my arms around your neck and tell you to love me always. That nothing else mattered. Nothing else does matter, dearest. Yes, it does. It matters whether you have used me to betray my people. Where were you at 12 o'clock the night before last? I'd rather not tell you. I demand it. The quizzical smile played about Sokola's mouth as he faced her frankly. I was in a gambling establishment. Whose? Johnny Worsham's. What were you doing there? You neither drink nor gamble. Again the dark face smiled. I was asked by my chief to report on the habits of every man in my department, particularly to report every man who frequents the gambling hells of Richmond. Jenny watched him nervously, her hands trembling. It's possible, of course. Her eyes suddenly filled with tears, and she threw herself into his arms. And then it happened. The little thing, trivial and insignificant, that makes and unmakes life. For a long while no words were spoken. With a gentle touch he soothed her trembling body, bending to kiss the waves of her rich brown hair. She pushed him at arm's length at last and looked up smiling. I can't help it. I love you. When will you learn that we must trust when we love? He stopped suddenly. Her brown eyes were fixed with terror on a single strand of curling blonde hair caught on the button of his waistcoat. What is it? He asked in alarm. She drew the hair from his coat carefully and held it to the light in silence. You can't be jealous. She looked at him curiously. Yes, a rival? A rival? Her eyes pierced him. Your love for the Union. I suspected you before. You've evaded my questions. Our love's been so big and sweet a thing that you have always stammered and hesitated to tell me a deliberate lie. It's not necessary now, I know. Yerrick Dahlgren's the age of my brother Billy. They used to play together in Washington at Commodore Dahlgren's home and at ours. He had the most peculiarly beautiful blonde hair I ever saw in a man. I'd know it anywhere on earth. That strand is his, poor boy. Besides, Dick Welford captured your messenger with that pathetic little bundle on his way to Washington. Sokola started in spite of his desperate effort at self-control and was about to speak when Jenny lifted her hand. Don't, please. It's useless to quibble and argue with me any longer. We face each other as souls bare. I don't ask you why you've deceived me. Your business as Federal spies deceive the enemy. You're not my enemy, he interrupted in a sudden burst of passion. You're my mate. You are mine by all the laws of God and nature. I love you. I worship you. We are not enemies. We've never been. We shall never be. With the last breath I breathe, your name shall be on my lips. You may speak your last word soon. What do you mean? I'm going to surrender you to the authorities. And you have just been sobbing in my arms, the man you swore to love forever? It's the only atonement I can make. Through you I've betrayed my country and my people. I would gladly die in your place. The hard thing will be to do my duty and give you up to the death you have earned. You deliver me to execution? Yes, was the firm answer. Listen to this. She seized a copy of the morning paper. Colonel Dahlgren's instructions to his men. This document was found on his person when shot. There's no question of its genuineness. She paused and read in cold, hard tones. Guides, pioneers with oakum, turpentine, and torpedoes, signal officer, quartermaster, commissary, scouts, and picked men in rebel uniform remain on the north bank and move down with the force on the south bank. If communication can be kept up without giving an alarm, it must be done. Everything dependent upon a surprise, and no one must be allowed to pass ahead of this column. All mills must be burned and the canal destroyed. Keep the force on the southern side posted of any important movement of the enemy, and in case danger, some of the scouts must swim the river and bring us information. We must try to secure the bridge to the city. That's 1 mile below Belle Isle, and release the prisoners at the same time. If we do not succeed, they must then dash down, and we will try to carry the bridge from each side. The bridges once secured and the prisoners loosed, and over the river the bridges will be secured and then the city destroyed. Jenny paused and lifted her eyes, burning with feverish eyes. Merciful God, how? With Oakham, Turpentine, a city of 100,000 inhabitants under the cover of darkness? Men, women, children, aged, the poor, the helpless? Sokola made no answer. Thoughtful, dreamy look masked his handsome features. Jenny read the next sentence from Dahlgren papers in high, quivering tones. The men must be kept together and well in hand, and once in the city it must be destroyed and Jeff Davis and his cabinet killed. The girl paused and fixed her gaze on Stokola. The man who planned this raid came in the willful and deliberate murder of unarmed men in his city. The man who helped him inside is equally guilty of his crime. She resumed her reading without waiting for a reply. Prisoners will go along with the combustible material. The officer must use his discretion about the time of assisting us. Pioneers must be prepared to construct a bridge or destroy one. They must have plenty of oakum and turpentine for burning, which will be rolled into soaked balls and given to the men to burn when we get into the city. Sokola lifted his hand. Please, dear, these instructions are not mine. I do not excuse or palliate them. The daring youngster who conceived this paid the penalty with his life. It's all that any of us can give for his country. There's something that interests me now far more than this sensation, far more than the mere fact that my true business have been discovered by you and my life forfeited to your government, and that is that the woman I love can deliver me to death. You doubt it? I have not believed it's possible. I'll show you. Jenny stepped to the door and pulled the old-fashioned bell cord. A servant appeared. In strained tones, the girl said, Go to Captain Welford's office and ask him to come here immediately with 2 soldiers. Yes'm. The Negro bowed and hurried from the house, and Jenny sat down in silence beside the door. Sokola confronted her, his hands gripped in nervous agony behind his back, his slender figure erect, his breath coming in deep, excited draughts. You think that I'll submit to my fate without a fight? You've got to submit. Your escape from Richmond is a physical impossibility. He searched the depths of her heart. I was not thinking of my body just then. I have no desire to live. If you can hand me over to my executioner. He paused, and a sob came from the girl's distracted soul. He moved a step closer. I am not afraid to die. You must know that. I am no coward. No, I couldn't have loved a coward. The thing I can endure is that you, the woman to whom I have surrendered my soul, should judge me worthy of death. Come, my own, this is madness. We must see each other as God sees now. You must realize that only the highest and noble motive could have sent a man of my character and training on such a mission. We differ in our political views for the moment, even as you differ from your older brother, whom you love and respected. I am not responsible for my brother's acts. I am for yours. Nonsense, dear heart. My work was ordained of God from the beginning. It was fate. Nothing could have stopped me. I came under a mighty impulse of love for my country, bigger than the North or the South. God sent me. You have helped me. But if you had not, I would have still succeeded. Can't you forget for the moment the details of this blood-stained struggle, the maimed lad with his crutches strapped to his saddle, lost in a black storm night, in the country of his enemy, shot to pieces? The mad scheme of his impulsive brain had dreamed of wiping your capital from the earth and leading 15,000 prisoners back to freedom and life. Surely he paid for his madness. Forget that I have deceived you, and see the vision which I dream. A purified, redeemed nation, united, no north, south, east, west, inheritance of all of our children, the children of the world's oppressed. I am fighting for you and yours as well as my own. The South is mine. I love its beautiful mountains, plains, its rivers and shining seas. Oh, my love, can't you see this divine vision of the future? The Union must be saved. The stars in their course fight its battles. Nothing is surer in the calendar of time than that the day is swiftly coming when the old flag your fathers first flung to the breeze will again be lifted from your Capitol building. You can't put me out of your life as a criminal worthy of death. I won't have it. I'm yours, and you are mine. I'm not pleading for my life. I'm pleading for something bigger and sweeter than life. I'm pleading for my love. I can laugh at death. I can endure that you put me out of your heart. Jenny rose with determination, walked to the window, and laughed hysterically. Well, I'm going to put you out. Captain Welford and his men are coming. They've just turned the corner. The man's figure slowly straightened and his eyes closed in resignation. Then it's God's will and my work is done. With a sudden cry, Jenny threw herself in his arms. Forgive me, dear Lord, I can't do this hideous thing. It's my duty, but I can't. My darling, my own, you shall not die. I was mad. Forgive me. Forgive me, my own.
Halt!
Sharp command of the captain rang outside the door. Get into this room, quick. The girl cried, pushing Sokola into the adjoining room and slamming the door as Dick entered the hall. She faced the captain with a smile. It's all right now, Dick. Thought I'd discovered an important secret. It was a mistake. The captain smiled. You don't mind my looking about the house? Searching the house? Just the lower floor? I do mind it. How dare you suggest such a thing, sir? Because I've made a guess at the truth. You discovered important evidence incriminating Sokola. Your first impulse was to do your duty. You weakened at the last moment. Absurd. I happened to hear a door slam as I entered. I'll have to look around a little. He started to the door behind which Sokola had taken refuge. Jenny confronted him. You can't go in there. It's no use, Jenny. I'm going to search that room. Whole house, if necessary. Why? I know Sokola's here. And if he is, I'll arrest him. On what charge? He's a federal spy, and you know it. You can't prove it. Found the evidence. I've searched his rooms. Searched his rooms? Your servant told me he was here, and I leaped to conclusion, forced his door, and found this. He thrust a well-thumbed copy of the cipher code of the Federal Secret Service into her hand. You can't execute him, Dick, Jenny sobbed. I will. You can't. I love him. He can do no more harm here. He's done enough. His life belongs to the South. She placed her trembling hand on his arm. You are sure that deep down in your heart there's not another motive? No matter how many motives, one's enough. I have the evidence on which to send him to the gallows. The girl's head drooped. And I gave it to you. God have mercy. The tears began to stream down her cheeks. Dick moved uneasily and looked the other way. I gotta do it, he repeated stubbornly. Her voice was the merest whisper when she spoke. You're not going to arrest him, Dick. He'll leave Richmond never to enter the South again. I pledge my life on his promise. His death can do us no good. It can do you no good. I couldn't live and know that I killed the man I love. You haven't killed him. He's forfeited his life 1,000 times in his work as a spy. Sent for you, I caused his betrayal. I shall be responsible if he dies. Again the little head drooped in pitiful suffering. She lifted at last with a smile. Dick, you're too big and generous for low revenge. You hate this man, but you love me. I know that. I'm proud and grateful for it. I appeal to the best that's in you. Saved my life and his. You couldn't live if he died, Jenny? The man asked tenderly. Not if he should die this way. The captain struggled and hesitated. Again her hand touched his arm. I asked the big divine thing of you, Dick. It's hard. I've won, and you take my triumph from me. For 2 years I've given body and soul to the task of unmasking this man. I'm asking his life and mine, the pleading voice repeated. I'll give him up on one condition. What? The captain held her gaze in silence a moment. But you send him back to the north forever and put him out of your life. Jenny laughed big, softly through her tears. You big, generous, foolish boy, you might have left that to me. All right, he hastened to agree. I'll leave it to you. Forgive me. I can't deny anything to you. You're a glorious lover, Dick, she cried tenderly. Why didn't I love you? I don't know, honey, he replied chokingly. We just love because we must. There ain't no rhyme or reason to it. He paused and laughed. Well, it's all over now, Jenny. I've given him back to you. Goodbye. She grasped his hand and held it firmly. Don't you dare say goodbye to me, sir. You've got to love me, too, as long as I live. My first sweetheart. Brave, generous, kind. She drew his blond head low and kissed him. He looked at her through dimmed eyes and slowly said, That makes life worth living, Jenny. He turned and quickly left the house. She heard his low orders to his men and watched them pass up the street with their rifles on their shoulders. She opened the door and Sokola entered, his face deathlike in its pallor. Why did he stay so long? He has searched your room and found your cipher code. And you have saved my life? It was I who put it in peril. No. I gave my life in willing sacrifice when the war begins. You are to leave, Jenny went on evenly. Leave at once, of course. And give me your solemn parole. Never again during this war to fight the South. "It is your right to demand it, and I agree." She gently took his hand. "I know that I can trust you now." She paused and looked wistfully into his face. "One last long look in your dear eyes." "Not the last." "One last kiss." She drew his lips down to hers. "One last moment in your arms." She clung to him desperately and freed herself with quick resolution. "Now you must go from Richmond, from the South, and out of my life forever." "You can't mean this," he protested bitterly. "I do," was the firm answer. "Goodbye." He pressed her hand and shook his head. "I refuse to say it." "You must." "No." "It's the end." "It's only the beginning." With a look of tenderness, he left her standing in the doorway, the hungry of eternity in her brown eyes. End of Chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 39, The Conspirators. The raid of Dahlgren and Kilpatrick had sent a thrill of horror throughout Richmond. The people had suddenly waked to the realization of what it meant to hold 15,000 desperate prisoners in their city with a handful of soldiers to guard them. The discovery on the young leader's body of remarkable papers of instructions to burn the city and murder the Confederate president and his cabinet produced a sharp discussion between Jefferson Davis and his counselors. Not only did the people of Richmond demand such methods of warfare be met by retaliation of the most drastic kind, but the cabinet now joined in this demand. Hundreds of prisoners had been captured both from Dahlgren's and Kilpatrick's division. It was urged on Davis with the most dogged determination that these prisoners, in view of the character of their instructions to burn a city crowded with unarmed men, women, and children, and murder in cold blood the civil officers of the Confederate government, should be treated as felons and executed by hanging. The president had refused on every occasion to lend his power to brutal measures of retaliation. This time his cabinet was persistent and in dead earnest in their purpose to force his hand. Davis faced the angry council with unruffled spirit. "I understand your feelings, gentlemen," he said evenly. "You have had a narrow escape. The South does not use such methods of warfare, nor will I permit our government to fall to such level and by an act of retaliation. The prisoners we hold are soldiers of the enemy's army. Their business is to obey orders, not plan campaigns." "We have captured officers also," Benjamin interrupted. "Subordinate officers are not morally responsible for the plans of their superiors." No argument could move the Confederate chieftain. He was adamant to all appeals for harsh treatment. Even Lee had at last found it impossible to maintain discipline in his army unless he prevented the review of his court-martial by Davis. The president was never known to sign the death warrant of a Confederate soldier. Lincoln was a man of equally tender heart, and yet the Northern president did sign the death warrants of more than 200 Union soldiers during his administration. The only action Davis would permit was the removal of the 15,000 prisoners further south to places of safety where such raids would be impossible. The prisons of Richmond were emptied and the stockades at Salisbury and Andersonville overcrowded with these men. Davis renewed the urgent appeal to the federal government for the exchange of these men. His request was treated with discourtesy and steadily refused. When the hot climate of Georgia caused the high death rate at Andersonville, he released thousands of these men without exchange and notified the Washington government to send transportation for them to Savannah. Lincoln had given Grant a free hand in assuming the command of all armies of the Union, but he watched this cruel policy of refusal to exchange prisoners with increasing anguish. In every way possible, without directly opposing his commanding general, the big-hearted president at Washington managed to smuggle Southern prisoners back into the South unknown to Grant and take an equal number of Union soldiers home. A crowd of Southern boys from the prison at Elmira, New York, were announced to arrive in Richmond on the morning train from Fredericksburg. Among them, Jenny expected her brother Jimmy, who had been captured in battle 6 months ago. She hurried to the station to meet them. A great crowd had gathered. A row of coffins was placed on the ground at the end of the long platform, awaiting the train south. A dozen men were sitting on these rude coffins, smoking, talking, laughing, their feet drawn up in tailor fashion to keep them out of the mud. With a shiver, the girl hurried to the other gate. Her eager eyes searched in vain among the ragged wretches who shambled from the cars. A man from Baton Rouge, whom she failed to recognize, lifted his faded hat and handed her a letter. She read it through her tears and hurried to the Confederate White House to show it to the president. Davis scanned the scrawl with indignant sympathy. Dear little sis, this is the last message I shall ever send. Before it can reach you, I shall be dead, for which I'll thank God. I'm sorry now I didn't take my chances with the other fellows, bribe the guard, and escape from Camp Douglas in Chicago. A lot of the boys did it. Somehow I couldn't stoop. Maybe the fear of the degrading punishment they gave McGoffin, the son of the governor of Kentucky, when he failed, influenced me, weak and despondent as I was. They hung him up by his thumbs to make him confess the name of his accomplices. He refused to speak, and they left him hanging until the balls of his thumbs both burst open and he fainted. The last month at Camp Douglas was noted for scant rations. Hunger was the prevalent epidemic. At the end of our barracks was the kitchen, and by the door stood a barrel into which was thrown beef bones and slop. I saw a starving boy fish out one of those bones and begin to gnaw it. A guard discovered him. He snatched the bone from the prisoner's hand, cocked his pistol, pressed it to his head, and ordered him on all fours and made him bark for the bone he held above him. We expected better treatment at Elmira, but I've lost hope. I'm too weak to ever pull up again. I've made friends with the guard who's given me the list of the men who've died here in the past 5 months since we came. In the first 4 months, out of 5,027 men held here, 1,311 died, 6.5% a month. Davis paused and shook his head. The highest rate we've ever known at Salisbury or Andersonville during those spring months was 3%. He finished the last line in quivering tones. There's not a chance on earth that I'll live to see you again. See the president and beg him for God's sakes to save as many of the boys as he can. With a heart full of love, Jimmy. The president took both of Jenny's hands in his. I need not tell you, my dear, that I have done and am doing my level best. The policy of the new federal commander is to refuse all offers of exchange. You understand my position? Perfectly, was the sorrowful message. Only came as a duty to bear his dying message. Express to your father and mother my deepest sympathy. With a gentle pressure of the chieftain's hand, the girl answered, I need not tell you I appreciate it. The president watched her go with a look of helpless anguish. His troubles, for a moment, had only begun. The returned prisoners had marched in a body to help to his office to thank their chief for his sympathy and help, and asked him to say something to them. Jenny paused and stared in a dazed way into the poor shrunken faces. When the president appeared, every ragged hat was in the air, and they cheered with all the might of the strength that was left in them. The girl burst into tears. These men, so forlorn, so dried up, with a strange half-animal, hunted look in their eyes, others restless and wild-looking, others calmly vacant in their stare, as if they'd been dead for years. A poor mother was rushing in and out among them, hunting for her son. He was coming with you boys, you know, she cried. She stopped suddenly and laughed at her own anxiety and confusion. He's here somewhere. I just can't find him. Help me, man. She hadn't spoken his name in her eager search for his loved face. She kept lifting the cloth from a basket of provisions which she had cooked that morning. I've got his breakfast here, poor boy. I expect he's hungry. She had lost all consciousness of the crowd now. She was talking to herself, trying to keep her courage up. The president looked into the emaciated faces before him and lifted his long arms in solemn salutation. Soldiers of the South, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for this tribute of your loyalty. You were offered your freedom in prison at any moment. If you would take the oath and false swear your allegiance to the South, you deliberately chose to live in death to the betrayal of your faith. I stand with uncovered head before you. I am proud to be the chief executive of such men. Again they cheered. The old mother with her basket was searching again for a boy. Jenny slipped an arm gently around her and led her away. On the day Lee left Richmond for the front to meet Grant's invading host, the Confederate president was in agony over a letter from General Winder portraying the want and suffering among the prisoners confined at Andersonville. If we could only get them across the Mississippi, Davis cried, where beef and supplies of all kinds are abundant. But what can we do for them here? Our men are in the same fix, Lee answered quickly, except that they're free. These sufferings are the result of our necessity, not of our policy. Do not distress yourself. The South was entering now the darkest hours of her want. The market price of food was beyond the reach of the poor, or even the moderately well-to-do. Turkeys sold for $60 each. Flour was $300 a barrel. Cornmeal was $50 a bushel. Boots were $200 a pair. A man's coat cost $350. His trousers $100. He could get along without a vest. Wood was $50 a cord. It took $1,800 to buy $100 in gold. In the midst of this universal suffering, the yellow journals of the South, led by the Richmond Examiner, made the most bitter and determined assaults on Davis to force him to a policy of retaliation on Northern prisoners. "Hoist the black flag," shrieked the Examiner. "Retaliate on those Yankee prisoners for the starvation and abuse of our men in the North, a land teeming with plenty." The president was held up to scorn and the scourges of the Southern people because, with quiet dignity, he refused to lower the standard of his government to a policy of revenge on helpless soldiers in his power. To a committee of the Confederate Congress who waited on him with insane demands, he answered with scorn, "You dare to ask me to torture helpless prisoners of war? I will resign my office at the call of my country. But no people have the right to demand such deeds at my hands." In answer to this brave, humane stand of the Southern president, the Examiner had the unspeakable effrontery to accuse him of clemency to his captives that he might curry favor with the North and shield himself if the South should fail. No characteristic of Davis was more marked than his regard for the weak, helpless, and the captive. His final answer to his assailants was to repeat with emphasis his orders to General Winder to see to it that the same rations issued to Confederate soldiers in the field should be given to all starving prisoners of war, though taken from a starving army and people. Enraged by the defeat of their mad schemes, the conspirators drew together now to depose Davis and set up a military dictatorship. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 40, In Sight of Victory. When Grant crossed the Rapidan with his army of 141,160 men, Lee faced him with 64,000. The problem of saving Richmond from the tremendous force under the personal command of the most successful general of the North was not the only danger which threatened the Confederate capital. Butler was pressing from the peninsula with 40,000 men along the line of McClellan's old march, supported again by the Navy. Jefferson Davis knew the task before Lee to be a gigantic one, yet he did not believe that Grant would succeed in reaching Richmond. The moment the Federal general crossed the Rapidan and threw his army into the tangled forest of the wilderness, Lee sprang from the jungles at his throat. Battle followed battle in swift and terrible succession at Cold Harbor. 30 days later, the climax came. Grant lost 10,000 men in 20 minutes. The Northern general had set out to hammer Lee to death by a steady, remorseless pounding. At the end of a month, he had lost more than 60,000 men, and Lee's army was as strong as when the fight began. Grant's campaign to take Richmond was the bloodiest and most tragic failure in the history of the war. The North, in bitter anguish, demanded his removal from command. Lincoln stubbornly refused to interfere with his bulldog fighter. He set him word to hold on and chew and choke. As Grant, in his whirl of blood, approached the old battlegrounds of McClellan, Davis rode out daily to confer with Lee. He was never more cheerful, never sure of the safety of the capital. His faith in God and the certainty that he would, in the end, give victory to a cause so just and holy grew in strength with the report from each glorious field. No doubt of the right or justice of his cause ever entered his mind. Day and night he repeated the lines of his favorite hymn, "I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand." Again and again he said to his wife, half in soliloquy, half in exalted prayer, "We can conquer peace against the world in arms and keep the rights of freemen if we are worthy of the privilege." The spirit which animated the patriotic soldiers who followed their commander in this bloody campaign was in every way as high as that which inspired their president. Jenny spent an hour each day ministering to the sick prisoners who had returned from the North and were unable to go further than Richmond. It was her service of love for Jimmy's friends and comrades. A poor fellow was dying of want he had endured in prison. He lifted his dim eyes to her. "Will you write my wife for me, miss?" Yes, I will. Give her my love." He paused for breath and fumbled in his pocket. "I've a letter for her here. Read it for you right. Her little girl has malaria. She tried Willow tea and everything she could think of for chills, but the doctor said nothing but quinine could save her. Couldn't get it. The blockade's too tight, and so her baby died. And now I'm dying, and my poor starving gal will have nothing to comfort her but—" He gasped and lifted himself on his elbow. "If our folks can just quit free men, it's all right. It's all right." The women and children of Richmond were suffering now for food. The 30th Virginia Regiment sent Billy Barton into the city with a contribution for their relief. Billy delivered it to Jenny with more than a boy's pride. There was something bigger in the quiet announcement he made. "Here's one day's ration from the regiment, sis," he said. "All our flour, pork, bacon, and meal. The boys are fasting today. It's their love offering to those who left at home." Jenny kissed him. "It's beautiful of you and your men. Give my love to them all and tell them I'm proud to be their countrywoman. And they're proud of their country and their general, too. Maybe you wouldn't believe it, but every regiment in Lee's army is re-enlisted for the war." She seized Billy's hand. "Come with me. I want you to see the president and tell him what your regiment's done. It'll help him." As they approached the White House, a long, piercing scream came through the open windows. "What on earth?" Jenny exclaimed. "An accident of some kind," the boy answered, seizing her arm and hurrying forward. Every window and door of the big, lonely house set apart on its hill swung wide open, the light streaming through them, the wind blowing the curtains through the windows. The light blazed even on the third story. Mrs. Burton Harrison, the wife of the president's secretary, met them at the door, her eyes red with weeping. She pressed Jenny's hand. "Little Joe's been killed." "Mrs. Davis, this beautiful boy? Impossible. He climbed to the banisters and fell to the brick pavement and died a few minutes after his mother reached his side." The girl could make no answer. She came on a sudden impulse to cheer the lonely leader of her people. Perhaps his need in this dark hour had called her. She thought of Socola's story of his mother's vision and wondered with a sudden pang of self-pity where the man she loved was tonight. This beautiful child, named in honor of his favorite brother, was the greatest joy of the badgered soul of the Confederate leader. Suddenly the white face appeared at the head of the stairs. A courier had come from the battlefield with an important dispatch. Grant and Lee were locked in their death grapple in the wilderness. He would try, even in this solemn hour, to do the whole duty. He passed the sympathetic group, murmuring a sentence whose pathos brought tears again to Jenny's eyes. "Not thy will, O Lord, but thine, thine, thine." He took the dispatch from the courier's hand and held it open for some time, staring at it with fixed gaze. He searched the courier's face and asked pathetically, "Will you tell me, friend, what's in it? I cannot read." The courier read the message in low terms. A great battle was joined. The fate of a nation hung on its issue. The stricken man drew from his pocket a tiny gold pencil and tried to write an answer, stopped suddenly, and pressed his hand on his heart. Billy sprang to his side and seized the dispatch. "I'll take the message to General Cooper, Mr. President." The white face turned to the young soldier and looked at him pitifully. "Thank you, my son, thank you. It is best. I must have this hour with our little boy. Leave me with my dead." Jenny stayed to help the stricken home. She took little Jeff in her arms to rock him to sleep. He drew her head down and whispered, "Miss Jenny, I got to Joe first after he fell. Knelt down beside him and said all the prayers I know, but God wouldn't take him." The girl drew the child close and kissed the reddened eyes. Over her head beat the steady tramp of the father's feet, back and forth, back and forth. A wounded lion in his cage. The windows and doors were still wide open, the curtains waving wan and ghost-like from their hangings. 2 days later she followed the funeral procession to the cemetery. Thousands of children, each child with a green bough or a bunch of flowers to pile on the red mound. A beautiful girl pushed her way to Jenny's side and lifted a handful of snowdrops. "Please put these on little Joe," she said wistfully. "I knew him so well." With a sob, the child turned and fled. Jenny never learned her name. She turned to the grave again, her gaze fixed on the striking figure of the grief-stricken father, bareheaded, straight as an arrow, his fine face silhouetted against the shining southern sky. The mother stood back amid the shadows. In her somber wrappings, her tall figure drooped in pitiful grief. The leader turned quickly from his personal sorrows to those of his country, his indomitable courage rising to greater heights as danger thickened. 2 weeks later, General Sheridan attempted what Dahlgren tried and failed to accomplish. The president hurried from his office to his home, seized his pistols, mounted his horse, and rode out to join Generals Gracie and Ransom, who were placing their skeleton brigades to repulse the attack. The crack of rifles could be distinctly heard from the executive mansion. The mother called her children to prayer. As little Jeff knelt, he raised his chubby face and said with solemn earnestness, "You'd better have my pony saddled and let me go out and help Father. We can pray afterward." In driving Sheridan's cavalry back from Richmond, General Stuart fell at Yellow Tavern, mortally wounded. The bravest of the brave, a full major general who had won immortal fame at 31 years of age. His beautiful wife, the daughter of Union General Philip St. George Cook, could not reach his bedside before he breathed his last. The president reverently entered the death chamber and stood for 15 minutes holding the hand of his brilliant young commander. They told him that he could not live to see his wife. "I should have liked to see her, but God's will be done." The doctor felt his fast-fading pulse. "Doctor, suppose I'm going fast now," Stuart said. "It will soon be over. I hope I have fulfilled my duty to my country and my God." "Your end is near, General Stuart," the doctor responded softly. "All right," was the even answer. "I'll end my little affairs down here. To Miss Robert E. Lee I give my gold spurs in eternal memory of the love I bear my glorious chief. To my staff, my horses." He paused and turned to the heavier officer who stood with bowed head. "You take the larger one. He'll carry you better. To my son I leave my sword." He was silent for a moment and then said with an effort, "Now I want you to sing for me the song I love the best. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." With his fast failing breath, he joined in the song, turned and murmured, "I'm going fast now, God's will be done." So passed the greatest cavalry leader our country has produced, a man whose joyous life was one long feast of goodwill toward his fellow men. In spite of all losses, in spite of 4 years of frightful carnage, in spite of the loss of Mississippi, the states of Louisiana and Tennessee, the Confederacy was in sight of victory. Lee had baffled Grant's great army at every turn and now held him securely at bay before Petersburg. The North was mortally tired of the bloody struggle. The party which demanded peace was greater than any political division. It included thousands of the best men in the party of Abraham Lincoln. The nomination of General McClellan for president on a platform declaring the war a failure and demanding that it end was a foregone conclusion. Jefferson Davis knew this from inside information his friends had sent him from every section of the North. The Confederacy had only to hold its lines intact until the first Monday in November, and the Northern voters would end the war. The one point of mortal danger to the South lay in the mental structure of General Joseph E. Johnston, the man whom Davis had been persuaded, against his better judgment, to appoint to the command of one of the greatest armies the Confederacy had ever put into the field. Johnston had been sent to Dalton, Georgia, placed in command of 68,000 picked Confederate soldiers with which to attack and drive Sherman out of the lower South. Lee, with 64,000, had defeated Grant's 140,000. Richmond was safe, and the North was besieging Washington with an army of heartbroken mothers and fathers who demanded Grant's removal. No effort was spared by Davis to enable Johnston to stay Sherman's advance and assume the offensive. The whole military strength of the South and West was pressed forward to meet him. His commissary and ordnance departments were the best in the Confederacy. His troops were eager to advance and retrieve the disaster at Missionary Ridge, the first and only case of panic and cowardice that had marred the brilliant record of the Confederacy. The position of Johnston's army was one of commanding strength. Long mountain ranges with few and difficult passes made it next to impossible for Sherman to turn his flank or dislodge him by direct attack. Sherman depended for his supplies on a single line of railroad from Nashville. Davis confidently believed that Johnston could crush Sherman in a first pitched battle and render his position untenable, and then began the most remarkable series of retreats recorded in the history of war. Without a blow and without waiting for an attack, Johnston suddenly withdrew from his trenches at Dalton and ran 18 miles into the interior of Georgia, He stopped at Resaca in a strong position on a peninsula formed by the junction of two rivers, fortified by rifle pits and earthworks. He gave this up and ran 13 miles further into Georgia to Adairsville. Not liking the look of Adairsville, he struck camp and ran to Cassville, 17 miles. He then declared he would fight Sherman at Kingston. Sherman failing to divide his army as Johnston had supposed he would, he changed his mind and ran behind Etowah. He next retreated to Allatoona. Here Sherman spread out his army, threatened Marietta, and Johnston ran again. On July 5th, he ran from Kennesaw Mountain and took refuge behind the Chattahoochee River. From Dalton to Resaca, from Resaca to Adairsville, from Adairsville to Allatoona, involving the loss of Kingston and Rome with their mills, foundries, and military stores, from Allatoona to Kennesaw, from Kennesaw to the Chattahoochee, and then tumbled into the trenches before Atlanta. Retreat had followed retreat for 2 months and a half, over 150 miles to the gates of Atlanta without a single pitched battle. Davis watched this tragedy unfold, its appalling scenes, with increasing bitterness, disappointment, and alarm. The demand for Johnston's removal was overwhelming in the state of Georgia, whose gate city was now besieged by Sherman. The people of the whole South had watched this retreat of 150 miles into their territory with sickening hearts. Again, Johnston began his nagging and complaining to the Richmond authorities. His most important message was an accusation of disloyalty against Joseph E. Brown. He telegraphed in blunt, plain English, "The governor of Georgia refuses me provisions and the use of his roads." Brown answered, "The roads are open to him and in capital condition. I furnished him abundantly with provisions." The President of the Confederacy now faced the most dangerous and tragic decision of his entire administration. The removal of Johnston from command before Sherman's victorious army in the heart of Georgia could be justified only on the grounds of the sternest necessity. The commanding general not only had the backing of his powerful junta in Richmond, who were now busy with their conspiracy to establish a dictatorship and oust the president from his office, but he was immensely popular with his army. His care for his soldiers was fatherly. His painful efforts to save their lives, even at the cost of the loss of his country, were duly appreciated by the leaders of opinion in the army. Johnston had the power to draw and hold the goodwill of the men who surrounded him. He had the power, too, infecting his men with his likes and dislikes. His hatred of Davis had been for 3 years the one mania of his sulking mind. To remove him from command in such a crisis was to challenge a mutiny in his army, which might lead to serious results. Yet if he should continue to retreat and back out of Atlanta without a fight, as he had backed out of every position for the 150 miles from Dalton, the results would be still more appalling. The loss of Atlanta at this moment meant the defeat of the Peace Party of the North and the re-election of Lincoln. If Lincoln should be elected, it was inconceivable that the South should continue the struggle for 4 more years. If Johnston would only hold his trenches and save Atlanta for a few days, the South would win. Lee could hold Grant off indefinitely. The thought which appalled Davis was the suspicion which now amounted to a practical certainty that his retreating general would evacuate Atlanta as he had threatened to abandon Richmond when confronted by McClellan and had abandoned Vicksburg without a blow. He must know this with absolute certainty before yielding to the demand for his removal. That no possible mistake could be made, he dispatched his chief of staff, General Braxton Bragg, to Atlanta for a conference with Johnston and make a personal appeal. Bragg reported that Johnston was arranging to abandon Atlanta without a battle, and the president promptly removed him from command and appointed Hood in his place. When Hood assumed command of the disgruntled army, it was too late to save Atlanta. Had Johnston delivered battle with his full force at Dalton, Sherman might have been crushed, as Rosecrans was overwhelmed at Chickamauga. Hood's army was driven back into the trenches. Sherman threw his hosts under cover of night on a wide flanking movement, and Atlanta fell. Under the mighty impulse of this news, Lincoln was re-elected, the Peace Party of the North defeated, and the doom of the Confederacy sealed. End of Chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 41, The Fall of Richmond. The conspirators who had complained most bitterly of Davis for the appointment of Lee to the command of the army before Richmond when McClellan was thundering at its gates now succeeded in passing through the Confederate Congress a bill to create a military dictatorship which they offered to the man for whose promotion they had condemned the president. Lee treated this attempt to strike the Confederate chieftain over his head with the contempt it deserved. Davis laughed at his enemies by the most complete acceptance of their plans. His answer to Senator Barton's committee was explicit. I have absolute confidence in General Lee's patriotism and military genius. I will gladly cooperate with Congress in any plan to place him in supreme command. Lee refused to accept the responsibility except with the advice and direction of the president, and the conspiracy ended in a fiasco. From the moment Sherman's army pierced the heart of the South, the Confederate president saw with clear vision that the cause of Southern independence was lost. Lee's army must slowly starve. His one supreme purpose now was to fight to the last ditch for better terms than unconditional surrender, which would mean the loss of billions of property and the possible enfranchisement of 1 million slaves. That Lincoln was intensely anxious to stop the shedding of blood he knew from more than one authentic source. It was rumored that the Northern president was willing to consider compensation for the slaves. An army of 100,000 determined Southern soldiers led by an indomitable general could fight indefinitely. That it was of the utmost importance to the life of the South to secure a surrender which would forbid the enfranchisement of the slaves and the degradation of the electorate to their level, Davis saw with clear vision. From the North now came overtures of peace. Francis P. Blair asked for permission to visit Richmond. Blair proposed the end of the war by uniting the armies of the North and South for an advance on Mexico to maintain the Monroe Doctrine against the new emperor who Europe had set upon the throne in the Western Hemisphere. The Confederate president received his proposals with courtesy. "I have tried in vain, Mr. Blair," he said gravely, "to open negotiations with Washington. How can the first step be taken?" "Mr. Lincoln, I am sure, will receive commissioners, though he would give me no assurance on that point. We must stop this deluge of blood. I cherish the hope that the pride and honor of the Southern states will suffer no shock in the adjustment." The result of this meeting was the appointment by Davis of 3 commissioners to meet the representatives of the United States. Alexander H. Stephens, R.M.T. Hunter, and Judge John A. Campbell were sent to this important conference. For some unknown reason, they were halted at Fortress Monroe and not allowed to proceed to Washington. A change had been suddenly produced in the attitude of the national government. Whether it was due to the talk of the men in Richmond who were trying to depose Davis, or whether it was due to the fall of Fort Fisher and the closing of the port of Wilmington, the last artery which connected the Confederacy with the outside world could not be known. The Confederate commissioners were met by Abraham Lincoln himself and his Secretary of State, William Seward, in Hampton Roads. The national government demanded, in effect, unconditional surrender. Davis used the indignant surprise with which this startling announcement was received in Richmond and the South to rouse the people to a last desperate effort to save the country from the deluge which the radical wing of the Northern Congress now threatened: the confiscation of the property of the whites, the enfranchisement of the Negro race. In his judgment, this could only be done by forcing the national government, through a prolongation of the war, to pledge the South some measure of protection before they should lay down their arms. Mass meetings were held, and the people called to defend their cause with their last drop of blood. The president made a speech that night to a crowd in Metropolitan Hall on Franklin Street in Richmond, which swept them into a frenzy of patriotic passion. Even his bitterest enemy, the editor of the Examiner, was spellbound by his eloquence when he first appeared on the speaker's stand and lifted his tall, thin figure, gazing over the crowd with glittering eye. A tremendous cheer swept the assembly. In that moment, he was the incarnate soul of the South. The chieftain of all the men who wore the gray in this hour of solemn trial stood before them with countenance like the lightning. Cheer on cheer rose and fell with throbbing passion. A smile of strange prophetic sweetness lighted his pale, haggard face. The ovation he received was the sure promise to his tired soul when the passions and prejudices, the agony and madness of war had passed, the people would understand all he had tried to do in their service. In that moment of divine illumination, he saw his place in the hearts of his countrymen and was content. He spoke with even restrained flow of words, with a mastery of himself and his audience that is the mark of the orator of the highest genius. His gestures were few. His low, vibrant, musical voice found within the hearts of the farthest listener. He swayed them with indescribable passion. Into the faces of the foe who demanded unconditional surrender, he hurled the defiance of an unconquered and unconquerable soul. He closed with an historical illustration which lifted his audience to the highest reach of emotion. Kossuth had abandoned Hungary with an army of 30,000 men in the field. The friends of liberty had never forgiven nor could forgive this betrayal. "What shall we say," he cried, "of the disgrace beneath which we should be buried if we surrender with an army in the field more numerous than that which Napoleon achieved the glory of France, an army standing among its homesteads, an army in which each individual is superior in warlike quality to the individual who opposes him?" When the tumult and the applause had died away, did he realize in the secret places of his heart that the spirit of the South had been broken by the terrible experiences of 4 years of blood and fire and death? His iron will gave no sign. To him, the manhood of the Southern soldier was unconquerable, his courage dauntless forever. 6 months after Sherman's sword had pierced the heart of the South from Atlanta, Lee's army in the trenches before Petersburg had reached the end of their endurance. Lee wired Davis that his thin line could hold back Grant's hosts but a few days and that Richmond must fall. His men were living on parched corn. The president hurried to the White House and slipped his arm around his wife. "You must leave the city now, my dear." "Please let me stay with you," she pleaded. "Impossible." He answered firmly. "My headquarters must be in the saddle. Your presence here could only grieve and distress me. You can take care of our babies. I know you wish to help and comfort me. You can do this, but in one way. Go and take the children to a place of safety." He paused, overcome with emotion. "If I live," he continued slowly, "you can come to me when the struggle is over, but I do not expect to survive the destruction of our liberties." He drew a small hoard of gold from his pocket, removed a $5 piece for himself, and gave it to his wife, together with the Confederate money he had on hand. "You must take only your clothing," he said after a moment's notice. "The flour and supplies in your pantry must be left. The people are in want." He had arranged for his family to settle in North Carolina. The day before his wife left, he gave her a pistol and taught her trembling hands to load, aim, and fire it. "The danger will be," he warned, "that you may fall into the hands of lawless bands of deserters from both armies who are even now pillaging and burning. You can, at least, if you must, force your assailants to kill you. If you cannot remain undisturbed in your own land, make for the coast of Florida and take a ship for a foreign country." Their hearts dumb with despair, his wife and children boarded the train, or the thing that had once been a train. The roof of the cars leaked and the engines wheezed and moved with great distress. The stern face of the Southern leader was set in his hour of trial. He felt that he might never again look on the faces of those he loved. His little girl clung convulsively to his neck in agonizing prayer that she might stay. The boy begged and pleaded with tears raining down his chubby face. Just outside of Richmond, the engine broke down, and the heartsick family sat in the dismal day coach all night. Sleepers had not been invented. They were 12 hours getting to Danville, a week on the way to Charlotte. The reign of terror had already begun. The president's wife avoided seeing people lest they should be compromised when the invading army should sweep over the state. They found everything well packed up in the house that had been rented, but while the big-hearted Jew, who was the agent, sent their meals from his house for a week, refusing every suggestion of pay, he offered his own purse or any other service he could render. When Burton Harrison had seen them safely established in Charlotte, he returned at once to his duties with the president in Richmond. On the beautiful Sunday morning of April 2nd, 1865, a messenger hurriedly entered St. Paul's Church, walked to the president's pew, and handed him a slip of paper. He rose and quickly left. Not a rumor had reached the city of Lee's broken lines. In fact, a false rumor had been published of a great victory with his starving army had achieved the day before. The reports of the evacuation of Richmond fell on incredulous ears. The streets were unusually quiet. Beyond the James, The fresh green of the spring clothed the fields in radiant beauty. The rumble of no artillery disturbed the quiet. Scarcely a vehicle of any kind could be seen. The church bells were still ringing their call to the house of God. The straight military figure entered the executive office. A wagon dashed down Main Street and back up in front of the customs house door. Boxes were hurried from the president's office and loaded into it. A low hum and clatter began to rise from the streets. The news of disaster and evacuation spread like lightning, and disorder grew. The streets were crowded with fugitives making their way to the depot, pale women with disheveled hair and tear-stained faces leading barefoot children who were crying in vague terror of something they could not understand. Wagons were backed to the doors of every department of the Confederate government. As fast as they could be loaded, they were driven to the Danville depot. All was confusion and turmoil. Important officers were not to be seen, and when they were found would answer no questions. Here and there, groups of mean-visaged loafers began to gather with ominous looks toward the houses of the better class. The halls of the silent Capitol building were deserted. A single footfall echoed with hollow sound. The municipal council gathered in a dingy little room to consider the surrender of the city. Mayor Mayo dashed in and out with the latest information he could get from the War Department. He was slightly incoherent in his excitement, but he was full of pluck and chewed tobacco defiantly. He announced that the last hope was gone and that he would maintain order with 2 regiments of militia. He gave orders to destroy every drop of liquor in the stores, saloons, and warehouses and establish a patrol. The militia slipped through the fingers of their officers, and in a few hours the city was without a government. Disorder, pillage, shouts, revelry, and confusion were the order of the night. Black masses of men swayed and surged through the dimly lighted streets, smashing into stores and warehouses at will. Some of them were carrying out the mayor's orders to destroy the liquor. Others decided that the best way to destroy it was to drink it. The gutters ran with liquor and the fumes filled the air. To the rear guard of Lee's army under Ewell was left the task of blowing up the vessels in the James and destroying the bridges across the river. The thunder of exploding mines and torpedoes now shook the earth. The ships were blown to atoms and the wharves fired. In vain the mayor protested against the firing of the great warehouses. Orders were orders, and the soldiers obeyed. The warehouses were fired, the sparks leaped to the surrounding buildings, and the city was in flames. As day dawned, a black pall of smoke obscured the heavens. The sun's rays lighted the banks of the rolling smoke with lurid glare. The roar of the conflagration now drowned out all the other sounds. The upper part of Main Street was choked with pillagers, men with drays, some with bags, some rolling their stolen barrels painfully up the hills. A small squadron of Federal cavalry rode calmly into the wild scene. General Wetzel, in command of 2 divisions of Grant's army on the north side, had sent in 40 Massachusetts troopers to investigate conditions. At the corner of 11th Street, they broke into a trot for the square and planted their guidons on the capital of the Confederacy. Long before this advance guard could be seen in the distance, the old flag of the Union had been flung from the top of the house on Church Hill. Foreseeing the fall of the city, Miss Van Lew had sent to the Federal commander for a flag. Through his scouts he had sent it. As Weitzel's 2 grand divisions swung into Main Street, this piece of bunting, 18 feet long and 9 feet wide, waved from the Van Lew mansion on the hill above him. Stretching from the Exchange Hotel to the slopes of Church Hill, down the hill, through the valley, and up the ascent, swept this gorgeous array of the triumphant army, its bayonets gleaming in the sunlight, every standard, battle flag, and guidon streaming in the sky, every band playing, swords flashing, and shout after shout rolling from end to end of the line. To the roar of the flames, the throb of drums, the scream of fife, the crash of martial music, and the sounds of marching hosts was added now the deep thunder of exploding shells in the burning arsenals. A regiment of Negro cavalry swept by the Exchange Hotel, and as they turned the corner drew their sabers with a savage shout. An old Virginian with white locks, standing in the doorway of a hotel, gazed on these Negro troops a moment, threw his heads on high, and solemnly cried, "Blow, Gabriel, blow your trumpet, for God's sake, blow." For hours the fires raged unchecked, burned until the entire business section of the city lay a smoldering heap of ashes. Crowds of men, women, and children crowded the Capitol Square, fighting with smoke and flying cinders for a breath of fresh air. Piles of furniture lay heaped on the greensward. Terror-stricken, weeping women had dragged it from their homes, and improvised tents made of broken tables and chairs, covered with sheets and bedding. Hundreds of homeless women and children huddled. At nightfall, the pitiful reaction came from the turmoil and excitement of the day. The quiet of great desolation brooded over the smoking ruins. In the rich and powerful North, millions were mad with joy. In New York, 20,000 people gathered in Union Square and sang the doxology. Jenny Barton was in Richmond through it all, and yet the tragedy made no impression on her heart or mind. A greater event absorbed her. Dick Welford had hurried to Lee's army on the day following Socola's departure from Richmond. He wanted to fight once more. Through all the whirlwind of death and blood, from the first crash with Grant in the Wilderness to his vain assault on Petersburg, he fought without a scratch. His life was charmed, and then, in the first day of the final struggle which broke the lines of Lee's charging army, he fell, leading his men in a glorious charge. He reached the hospital in Richmond the day before the city's evacuation. Jenny had watched by his bedside every hour since his arrival, but few words passed between them. She let him hold her hand in silence, always looking and smiling his deathless love. He had not spoken Socola's name, nor had she. "It's funny, Jenny," he said at last. "I don't hate him any more." The girl's head drooped and the tears streamed down her cheeks. "Please, Dick, don't." "Yes," he murmured. "I want to talk about it, and you must hear me, won't you?" "Of course you wish it," she answered tenderly. "You see, I don't hate these Yankee soldiers no more, anyhow. Saw too many of 'em die from Wilderness to Petersburg. Brave, manly fellers. The fire of battle has burned the hate out of me. Now I just want you to be happy, Jenny dear, that's all. Goodbye." His hand slipped from hers, and in a moment his spirit had passed. End of Chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Victim, a romance of the real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 42, The Capture. At midnight on the day of the evacuation, the President and his cabinet left Richmond for Danville. He still believed that Lee might cut his way through Grant's lines and join his army with Johnston's in North Carolina. Lee had restored Johnston to command of the small army that yet survived in opposition to Sherman. He had hopes that Johnston's personal popularity with the soldiers might in a measure restore their spirits. The President established his temporary capital at Danville. G.W. Sutherland placed his beautiful home at his disposal. Communications with Lee had been cut, and the wildest rumors were afloat. Davis wrote his last proclamation urging his people to maintain their courage. In this remarkable document he said, "I announce to you, my fellow countrymen, that it is my purpose to maintain your cause with my whole heart and soul. I will never consent to abandon to the enemy 1 foot of the soil of any of the states of the Confederacy. If by stress of numbers we should be compelled to a temporary withdrawal from the limits of Virginia or any other border state, we will return until the baffled and exhausted enemy shall abandon in despair his endless and impossible task of making slaves of a people resolved to be free. Let us then not despair, my countrymen, but relying on God, meet the foe with fresh defiance and with unconquered and unconquerable hearts." So Washington spoke to his starving, freezing little army at Valley Forge in the darkest hour of our struggle for independence against Great Britain. With the help of France, Washington succeeded at last. Davis was destined to fail. No friendly foreign power came to his aid. His courage was none the less sublime for this reason. Lee's skeleton army surrendered to Grant at Appomattox on April 9th, and Davis hurried to Greensboro, where Johnston and Beauregard were encamped with 28,000 men. 200 schoolgirls marched to the house in Danville and cheered him as he left. Mrs. Sutherland, in the last hour of his stay, asked for a moment of his time. He ushered her into his room with grave courtesy. "Dear madam," he began smilingly, "you have risked your home and the safety of your husband to honor me in the South. I thank you for myself and the people. Is there anything I can do to show how much I appreciate it?" "You've greatly honored us by accepting our hospitality," was the quick, cheerful answer. "We shall always be rich in its memory. I have but one favor to ask of you. Name it. She drew a little bag from a basket and handed it to him. Accept this gift we've saved. It will help you on your journey. It's only $1,000 in gold. I wish it were more. The president's eyes grew dim and he shook his head. No, 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 dear Mrs. Sutherland. Your needs will be greater than mine. Besides, I have asked all for the cause, nothing for myself. Nothing. He left Danville with his heart warmed by the smiles and cheers of 200 beautiful girls and the offer of every dollar a patriotic woman possessed. He had need of its memory to cheer him at Greensboro. Here he felt for the first time the results of the malignant campaign which Holden's Raleigh Standard had waged against him and his administration. So great was the panic and so bitter the feeling which Holden's sheet had roused that it was impossible for the president and his cabinet to find accommodations in any hotel or house. He was compelled to camp in a freight car. It remained for a brave Southern woman to resent this insult to the chieftain. When Mrs. C.A.L. Homedew learned that the president was in town, housed in a freight car and shunned by the citizens, she sent him a note and begged him to make her house his home and to honor her by commanding anything in it and all that she possessed. The leader at this moment was preparing to leave for Charlotte and had declined her generous and brave offer, but he was deeply moved. He stopped his work to write her a beautiful letter of thanks. His interview with Johnston and Beauregard was strained and formal. Johnston's army in its present position in the hands of a resolute and daring commander could have formed a light column of 10,000 cavalry and cut its way through all opposition to the Mississippi River. Knowing the character of its general so well, he had small hopes. After receiving the report of the condition of the army, the president called his cabinet to consider what should be done. Johnston sat at a great distance from Davis, as the room would permit. The president reviewed briefly the situation and turned calmly to Johnston. General, we should like now to hear your views. The reply was given with brutal brevity and in tones of unconcealed defiance and hatred. Sir, the great retreater blurted out, my views are that our people are tired of war, feel themselves whipped, and will not fight. A dead silence followed. The president turned in quiet dignity to Beauregard. And what say you, General Beauregard? I agree with what General Johnston said, he replied. There was no appeal from the decision of these two commanders in such an hour. The president dictated a letter to General Sherman suggesting their surrender and outlining the advantageous terms which the Northern commander accepted. And then the Confederate chieftain received a message so amazing he could not at first credit its authority. A courier from Sherman conveyed the announcement to Johnston that Davis might leave the country on a United States vessel and take whoever and whatever he pleased with him. The answer of Jefferson Davis was characteristic. Please thank General Sherman for his offer and say that I can do no act which will put me under obligation to the federal government. Sherman had asked Lincoln at their last interview whether he should capture Davis or let him go. A sunny smile overspread the rugged features of the national president. That reminds me, he said, of a temperance lecture in Illinois. Wet and cold. He stopped for the night at a wayside inn. The landlord, noting his condition, asked if he would have a glass of brandy. No, 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 came the quick reply. I am a temperance lecturer, and I do not drink. He paused, and his voice dropped to a whisper. I would like some water, however, and if you should, of your own accord, put a little brandy in it, unbeknownst to me, why, it'll be all right. Sherman was trying to carry out the wishes of the man with the loving heart. At Charlotte, Davis was handed a telegram announcing the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. His thin face went death white. Handing the telegram to his secretary, he quickly said, I'm sorry, we have lost our noblest and best friend in the court of the enemy. He immediately telegraphed the news to his wife, who had fled further south to Abbeville, South Carolina. Mrs. Davis burst into tears on reading the fatal message. Her woman's intuition saw the vision of horror which the tragedy meant to her and to her stricken people. The president left Charlotte with an escort of 1,000 cavalrymen for Abbeville. His journey was slow. The wagons were carrying all that remained of the Confederate treasury with the money and currency from the Richmond banks, which had been entrusted to the care of the Secretary of the Treasury. Davis stopped at a little cabin on the roadside and asked the lady who stood in the doorway for a drink of water. She turned to comply with his request. While he was drinking, a baby barely able to walk crawled down the steps and toddled to him. The mother smiled. "Is this not President Davis?" she asked, trembling. "It is, madam," he answered with a bow. She pointed proudly to the child. "He's named for you." The president drew a gold coin from his pocket and handed it to the mother. "Please keep it for my little namesake and tell him when he's old enough to know." As he rode away with Reagan, his faithful postmaster general, he said, "The last coin I had on earth, Reagan. I wouldn't have had that but for the fact that I've never seen one like it and kept it for luck." "I reckon the war is about finished," the general replied. "Yes," Davis cheerfully answered. "My home is a wreck. Benjamin and Breckenridge are in federal hands. Mallory's fine residence of Pensacola has been burned by the enemy. Your home in Texas has been wrecked and burned." He paused and drew from his pocketbook a few Confederate bills. "That is my estate at the present moment." He received the next day a letter from his wife which greatly cheered him. Abbeville, South Carolina, April 28, 1865. My dear old husband, your very sweet letter reached me safely by Mr. Harrison, and it was a great relief. I leave here in the morning at 6 o'clock for the wagon train going to Georgia. Washington will be the first place I shall unload at. From there, we shall probably go on to Atlanta or thereabouts and wait a little until we hear something of you. Let me beseech you not to calculate upon seeing me unless I happen to cross your shortest path toward your bourne, be that what it may. It is surely not the fate to which you invited me in brighter days, but you must remember that you did not invite me to a great home, but to that of a plain farmer. I have shared all your triumphs, been the only beneficiary of them, now that I am claiming the privilege for the first time of being all to you, since these pleasures have passed for me. My plans are these, subject to your approval. I think I shall be able to procure funds enough to enable me to put the two eldest in school. I shall go to Florida if possible, and from thence go over to Bermuda or Nassau, and then from thence to England, unless a good school offers elsewhere, and put them to the best school I can find, and then with the two youngest join you in Texas. And that is the prospect which bears me up to be once more with you, if need be. But God loves those who obey him, and I know there is a future for you. Here they are all your friends, and have the most unbounded confidence in you. Mr. Burt and his wife have urged me to live with them, offered to take the chances of the Yankees with us, begged to have little Maggie, done everything, in fact, that relatives could do. I shall never forget their generous devotion to you. I have seen a great many men who have gone through. Not one has talked fight. A stand cannot be made in this country. Do not be induced to try it. As to the Trans-Mississippi, I doubt if at first things will be straight. But the spirit is there, and the daily accretions will be great when the deluded of this side are crushed between the upper and nether millstones. But you have not tried the strict Constitution fallacy. If we are to require a Constitution, it must be stretched during our hours of outside pressure, if it covers us at all. Be careful how you go to Augusta. I get rumors that Brown is going to seize all government property, and the people are averse and mean to resist with pistols. They are a set of wretches together, and I wish you were safe out of their land. God bless you and keep you. I have wrestled with him for you. I believe he will restore us to happiness. Devotedly, your wife. Kindest regard to Robert, and thanks for faithful conduct. Love to Johnson and John Wood. Maggie sends you her best love. The president and his party reached Abbeville on May 1st, only to find that his wife had left for Washington, Georgia. At Abbeville, the home of Armistead Burt, Davis called his last cabinet meeting and council of war. There were present 5 brigade commanders, General Braxton Bragg, his chief of staff, Breckinridge, Benjamin, and Reagan of his cabinet. The indomitable spirit made the last appeal for courage and the continuance of the fight until better terms could be made that might save the South from utter ruin and the shame of possible Negro rule. He faced them with firm resolution, his piercing eye undimmed by calamity. "The South, gentlemen," he declared, "is in a panic for the moment. We have resources to continue the war. Let those who remain with arms in their hands set the example, and others will rally. Let the brave men yet with me renew their determination to fight. Around you, reinforcements will gather. The replies of his discouraged commanders were given in voice that sank to whispers. Each man was called on for his individual opinion. Slowly and painfully each gave his answer in the negative. The war was hopeless, but they would not disband their men until they had guarded the president to a place of safety. No, Davis answered passionately. I will listen to no proposition for my safety. I appeal to you for the cause of my country. Stand by it, men. Stand by it. His appeal was received in silence. His counselors could not agree with him. The proud old man drew his slender body to its full height, lifted his hands, and cried pathetically, "The friends of the South consent to her degradation." He attempted to pass from the meeting, his emaciated face white with anger. His step tottered and his body swayed and would have sunk to the floor had not General Breckinridge caught him in his arms and led him from the room. Benjamin parted from the president when they crossed the Savannah River, and he had dropped the seal of the Confederate government in the depths of its still, beautiful waters. "Where are you going?" Reagan asked. "To the farthest place from the United States," was the quick reply, "if it takes me to China." Benjamin made his way successfully to England and won fame and fortune in the Old World. On hearing that the Federal cavalry was scouring the countryside, Breckinridge and Reagan proposed that Davis disguise himself in a soldier's clothes, a wool hat, and brogan shoes, take one man with him, and go to the coast of Florida, ship to Cuba. His reply was firm. "I shall not leave Southern soil while a Confederate regiment is on it. Kirby Smith has an army of 25,000 men. He has not surrendered. General Hampton will cut his way across the Mississippi. We can lead an army of 60,000 men on the plains of Texas and fight until we get better terms than unconditional surrender." Breckinridge was left at Washington to dispose of the small sum yet left in the Treasury and turn over to their agent the money of the Richmond banks. Robert Toombs lived in Washington. General Reagan called on the distinguished leader. He invited his guest into his library and closed the door. "You have the money, Reagan?" "Enough to take me west of the Mississippi." "You're well mounted?" "One of the best horses in the country." "I'm at home," he added generously. "I can command what I want, and if you need anything, I can supply you." "Thank you, General," Reagan responded heartily. Toombs hesitated a moment, then asked suddenly, "Has President Davis money?" "No, but I have enough to take us across Mississippi." "Is Mr. Davis well mounted?" "He has a fine Kentucky, and General Lee sent him at Greensboro by his son Robert, his gray war-horse Traveler, as a present. He has 2 first-class horses." Again Toombs was silent. "Mr. Davis and I," he went on thoughtfully, "have had our quarrels. We have none now. I want you to say to him that my men are all around here, and if he desires it, I will call them together and see him safely across the Chattahoochee River at the risk of my life." "I'll tell him, General Toombs," Reagan cordially responded, "and I appreciate your noble offer. It differs from the others who pretended to be his best friends. They are getting away from him as fast as they can. Some are base enough to malign him to curry favor with the enemy. I've known Jefferson Davis intimately for 10 years. The past 4 years of war, I have been with him daily, under every condition of victory and defeat, and I swear to you that he's the truest, gentlest, bravest, tenderest, manliest man I've ever known." "Let me know," Toombs urged, "if I can serve him in any possible way." When Reagan delivered the message to the president, he responded warmly. "That's like Toombs. He was always a whole-souled man. If it were necessary, I should not hesitate to accept his offer." He was slowly reading his wife's last letter, which had been delivered to him by scouts who were faithful. They were riding in a wagon with picked Mississippi teamsters 20 miles below Washington. All well with Winnie sweet and smiling. Billy plenty of laughter and talking with the teamsters keeps quiet. Jeff is happy beyond expression. Maggie 1 and 2 quite well. I have $2,500, something to sell, and I have heart and a hopeful one, but above all, my precious only love, a heart full of prayer. My God keep you and have his. sword and buckler over you. Do not try to make a stand on this side. It is not in the people. Leave your escort and take another road often. Alabama is full of cavalry, fresh and earnest in pursuit. May God keep you and bring you safe to the arms of your devoted Winnie. He opened and read another. My own precious Bonnie, may God give us both patience against this heavy trial. The soldiers are very unruly and have taken almost all the mules and horses from the camp. Do not try to meet me. I dread the Yankees getting news of you so much. You are the country's only hope, and the very best intentions do not advise a stand on this side of the river. Why not cut loose from your escort? Go swiftly and alone, with the exception of 2 or 3. Oh, may God in his goodness keep you safe, my own. Maggie says she has your prayer book safe. May God keep you, my old and only love, as ever devotedly your own, Winnie. He had not seen his wife and babies since they left Richmond. The conduct of the soldiers determined his course. He turned to Reagan. This move will probably cause me to be captured or killed. You are not bound to go with me, but I must protect my family. I'll go with you, sir, was the prompt response. The soldiers were dismissed, and the money still remaining in the treasury divided among them. A picked guard of 10 men rode with the fallen chieftain in search of his loved ones. They joined Mrs. Davis after a hard ride and found her camp threatened by marauders. He traveled with her 2 days, and apparently out of danger, she begged him to leave her and make good his escape. He finally agreed to do this, and with Reagan, the members of his staff, and Burton Harrison, his secretary, started for the Florida coast. The day was one of dismal fog and rain, and the party lost the way, turning in a circle, and at sunset met Mrs. Davis and her company at the fork of the road near the Ocmulgee River. The president and staff traveled with his wife the next day and made 28 miles. At Irwinsville, their presence was betrayed to the Federal cavalry. His camp surrounded by Colonel Pritchard and the Confederate president and party arrested. The soldiers plundered his baggage, tore open his wife's trunks, and scattered her dresses. In one of these trunks, they found a pair of new hoop skirts which Mrs. Davis had bought but never worn. An enterprising newspaper man immediately invented and sent broadcast the story that Jefferson Davis had been captured trying to escape in his wife's hoop skirts. His enemies refused to hear any contradiction of this invention. It was too good not to be true. They clung to it long after Colonel Pritchard and every man present had given it the lie. They had traveled a day's journey toward Macon, the headquarters of General Wilson, when an excited man galloped into the camp, waving over his head a printed slip of paper. "What is it?" Davis asked of his guard. The guard seized and read the slip and turned it to the Confederate chieftain and his wife. Andrew Johnson's proclamation offering a reward of $100,000 for the capture of Jefferson Davis as the murderer of Abraham Lincoln. A cry of anguish came from his faithful wife. The leader touched her shoulder gently. "Hush, my dear. The miserable scoundrel who wrote that proclamation knows that it is false. He is the one man in the United States who knows that I preferred Abraham Lincoln in the White House to him or any other man the North might elect. Such an accusation must fail." The wife was not comforted. "These men may assassinate you." The soldiers crowded about their defenseless prisoner and heaped on him the vilest curses and insults. He made no answer. The faraway look in his eagle eye told them only too plainly that he did not hear. Colonel Pritchard, in his manly way, made every effort to protect him from insult. Within a short distance of Macon, the prisoners were halted and their escorts drawn up in a line on either side of the road. Colonel Pritchard had ridden into Macon for a brigade to escort his captives through the streets of the city. The soldiers again cursed and jeered. The children climbed into their father's arms, kissed and hugged him tenderly, and put their little hands over his ears that he should not hear what they said. He soothed their fears and comforted them with beautiful lines from the Psalms, which he quoted in tones of marvelous sweetness. General Wilson received his distinguished prisoner with the deference due to his rank and character. His guard, in silence, opened their lines and presented arms as Davis entered the building. End of Chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 43, The Victim. Sokola hurried into Richmond 3 days after its fall in the desperate hope that he might be of service to Jenny. He was 2 days in finding her. She had offered her services to Mrs. Hopkins at the Alabama hospital. He sent in his card and she refused to see him. He asked an interview with Mrs. Hopkins and begged her to help. Her motherly heart went out to him in sympathy. His utter misery was so plainly written on his drawn face. "You are so like my own mother, madam," he pleaded. "I'm an orphan today. Our army has conquered, but I have lost. I find myself repeating an old question. What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and forfeit his life? She is my life. I won't give her up. Tell her that she must see me. I will not leave Richmond until I see her. If she leaves, I'll follow her to the ends of the world. Tell her this." The gentle hand pressed his. "I'll tell her." "And try to help me?" he begged. "All the world loves a lover," the fine thin lips slowly repeated. "Yes, I'll try." At the end of 10 minutes she returned alone. Her face gave no hope. "I'm afraid it's useless. She positively refuses." "You gave her my message?" "Yes. I'll wait today and try again." "You knew of Captain Welford's death, I suppose?" Sokola stared and turned pale. "No. He died and was buried 2 days ago near the spot where General Stewart sleeps." The lover was stunned for a moment. The hidden thought flashed through his mind that she might have married Welford in reaction over her discovery of his deception. He opened his lips to ask the question and held his peace. It was impossible. She couldn't have done such a thing. He put the idea out of his heart. "Thank you for the information, dear madam." He answered gravely, turned, and left the building. He walked quickly to his hotel, hired a Negro to get him a wreath of roses, and meet him at the cemetery gate. He had just placed them on Welford's grave as Jenny suddenly appeared. She stopped, transfixed in astonishment, her eyes wide with excitement. He walked slowly to meet her, and stood looking into her soul, searching its depths. "You're here," she gasped. "Yes, I brought my tribute to a brave and generous foe. He hated me, perhaps, but for your sake he gave me my life. I never hated him." "With his last breath he told me that he no longer hated you," she answered dreamily. "And you cannot forgive?" "No. Our lives are far apart now. The gulf between us can never be passed." He smiled tenderly and spoke with vibrant passion. "I'm going to show you that it can be passed. I'm going to love you with such devotion I'll draw you at last with resistless power." "Never." She turned quickly and left him gazing wistfully at her slender figure silhouetted against the glow of the sunset. End of Chapter 43. Chapter 44 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 44, Prison Bars. The ship which bore the distinguished prisoner from Savannah did not proceed to Washington, but anchored in Hampton Roads at Fortress Monroe. A little tug puffed up and drew alongside the steamer. She took off Alexander H. Stevens, General Joe Wheeler, and Burton Harrison. Stevens and Wheeler were sent to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. The next day the tug returned. Little Jeff ran to his mother, trembling and sobbing. "They say they've come for Father. Beg them to let us go with him." Davis stepped quickly forward and returned with an officer. "It's true," he whispered. "They have come for Clay and me. Try not to weep. These people will gloat over your grief." Mrs. Davis and Mrs. Clay stood close, holding each other's hands in silent sympathy and grim determination to control their emotions. They parted with their husbands in dumb anguish. As the tug bore the fallen chieftain from the ship, he bared his head, drew his tall figure to its full height, and standing between the files of soldiers, gazed on his wife and weeping children until the mists drew their curtain over the solemn scene. Mrs. Davis's stateroom was entered now by a raiding party headed by Captain Hudson. Her trunks were again forced open and everything taken which the captain or his men desired, among them all her children's clothes. Jeff seized the little soldier uniform of Confederate gray and ran with it. He managed to hide and save it. Captain Hudson then demanded the shawl which Davis had thrown over his shoulders on the damp morning when he was captured. "You have no right to steal my property," his wife replied indignantly. "Peace has been declared. The war is over. This is plain robbery." Hudson called in another file of soldiers. "Hand out that shawl, or I'll take the last rag you have on earth. I'll pay you for it if you wish, but I'm going to have it." Mrs. Davis took the shawl from Mrs. Clay's shoulders and handed it to the brute. "At least I may get rid of your odious presence," she cried, "by complying with your demand." Hudson took the shawl with a grin and led his men away. Two of his officers returned in a few minutes and thrust their heads into the stateroom of Mrs. Davis's sister, with whom Mrs. Clay was sitting. "Gentlemen, this is a ladies' stateroom," said the senator's wife. One of them threw open the door violently and growled, "There are no ladies here." "I am quite sure," was the sweet reply, "that there are no gentlemen present." With an oath they passed on. Little tugs filled with vulgar sightseers steamed around the ships and shouted a continuous stream of insults when one of the Davis party could be seen. General Nelson A. Miles, the young officer who had been appointed jailer of Jefferson Davis and Clement C. Clay, boarded the ship and proceeded without ceremony to give his orders to their wives. "Will you tell me, General," Mrs. Davis asked, "where my husband is imprisoned and what his treatment is going to be?" "Not a word," was the short reply. His manner was so abrupt and boorish she did not press for further news. Miles ventured some of his own account. "Jeff Davis announced the assassination of Abraham Lincoln the day before it happened. I guess he knew all about it." The wife bit her lips and suppressed a sharp answer. Her husband's life was now in this man's hands. "You are forbidden to buy or read a newspaper," he added curtly, "and your ship will leave this port under sealed orders." In vain Davis pleaded that his wife and children might be allowed to go to Washington or Richmond, where they had acquaintances and friends. "They will return to Savannah," Miles answered, "by the same ship in which they came, and remain in Savannah under military guard." Jefferson Davis was imprisoned in a casemate of Fortress Monroe, the embrasure of which was closed with a heavy iron grating. The two doors which communicated with the gunner's room were closed with heavy double shutters fastened with crossbars and padlocks. The side openings were sealed with fresh masonry. Two sentinels with loaded muskets paced the floor without a moment's pause, day and night. Two other sentinels and a commissioned officer occupied the gunner's room, the door and window of which were securely fastened. Sentinels were stationed on the parapet overhead, whose steady tramp day and night made sleep impossible. The embrasure opened on the big ditch which surrounded the fort, 60 feet wide and 10 feet deep in salt water. Beyond the ditch on the glacis was a double line of sentinels, and in the casement rooms on either side of his prison were quartered that part of the guard which was not on post. To render rest or comfort impossible, a lighted lamp was placed within 3 feet of the prisoner's eyes and kept brightly all night. His jailer knew that he had but one eye whose sight remained, and that he was a chronic sufferer of neuralgia. His escape from Fortress Monroe was a physical impossibility, without one of the extraordinary precautions taken. The purpose of these arrangements could have only been to inflict pain, humiliation, and possibly take his life. He had never been robust since the breakdown of his health on the western plains. Worn by privation and exposure, approaching 60 years of age, he was in no condition physically to resist disease. The damp walls, the coarse food, the loss of sleep caused by the tramp of sentinels inside his room, outside and on the roof over his head, and the steady blaze of a lamp in his eyes at night, within 48 hours had completed his prostration. But his jailers were not content. On May 23rd, Captain Titlow entered his cell with two blacksmiths bearing a pair of heavy leg irons, coupled together by a ponderous chain. "I am sorry to inform you, sir," the polite young officer began, "that I have been ordered to put you in irons." "Has General Miles given that order?" "He has. I wish to see him at once, please." "General Miles just left the fort, sir." "You can postpone the execution of your order until I see him?" "I have been warned against delay." "No soldier ever gave such an order," was the stern reply. "No soldier should receive or execute it." "His orders are from Washington. Mine are from him. But he can telegraph. There must be some mistake. No such outrage is on the record in the history of nations." "My orders are peremptory. You shall not inflict on me and my people through me this insult worse than death. I will not submit to it." "I sincerely trust, sir," the captain urged kindly, "that you will not compel me to use force." "I am a gentleman and a soldier, Captain Titlow," was the stern answer. "I know how to die." He paused and pointed to the sentinel which stood ready. Let your man shoot me at once. I will not submit to this outrage. The prisoner backed away with his hand on a chair and stood waiting. The captain turned to his blacksmiths. Do your duty. Put them on him. As the workman bent with his chain, Davis hurled him to the other side of the cell and lifted his chair. The sentinel cocked and lowered his musket, advancing on the prisoner, who met him defiantly with bared breast. The captain sprang between them. Put down your guns. I'll give you orders to fire when necessary. He turned to the officer at the door. Bring in 4 of your strongest men, unarmed. You understand? Yes, sir. The men entered, sprang on their helpless victim, bore him to the floor, pinned him down with their heavy bodies, and held him securely while the blacksmith riveted the chains on one leg and fastened the clasp on the other with a heavy padlock. He had resented this cowardly insult for himself and his people. He had resisted with the hope that he might be killed before it was accomplished. He saw now with clear vision that the purpose of his jailer was to torture him to death. His proud spirit rose in fierce rebellion. He would cheat them of their prey. They might take his life, but it should be done under the form of law on open day. He would live. He would defy death. He would learn to sleep with the tramp of 3 sets of sentinels in his ears. He would eat their coarse food at whatever cost to his feelings. He would learn to bury his face in bedding to avoid the rays of the lamp with which they were trying to blind him. He had need of all his fierce resolution. He had resolved to ask no favors, but his suffering had been so acute his determination melted at the doctor's kind expressions. The physician found him stretched on his pallet, horribly emaciated and breathing with difficulty, his whole body a mere fascine of raw, aged, and tremulous nerves, his eyes restless and fevered, his head continually shifting from side to side, searching instinctively for a cool spot on the hot, coarse hair pillow. Tell me, Dr. Craven said kindly, what can I do to add for your comfort? The question was asked with such genuine sympathy it was impossible to resist it. A smile flickered about his thin mouth. This camp mattress, doctor, he slowly replied. I find it a little thin. The slats beneath chafe my poor bones. I have a frail body, though in my youth and my young manhood while soldiering in the West I have done some rough camping and campaigning. There was flesh then to cover up my nerves and bones. The doctor called an attendant. Bring this prisoner another mattress and a softer pillow. Thank you, Davis responded cordially. You are a smoker? The doctor asked. I have been all my life until General Miles took my pipe and tobacco. The doctor wrote to the adjutant general and asked that his patient be given the use of his pipe. On his visit 2 days later, the doctor said, You must spend as little time in bed as possible. Exercise will be your best medicine. The prisoner drew back the cover and showed the lacerated ankles. Impossible, you see. The pain is so intense I can't stand erect. These shackles are very heavy. If I stand, the weight of them cuts into my flesh. They already have torn broad patches of skin from the places they touch. If you can pad a cushion there, I will gladly try to drag them about. Dr. Craven sought the jailer. General Miles, he began respectfully, in my opinion, the conditions of State Prisoner Davis require the removal of his shackles until such time as his health shall be established on a firmer basis. Exercise he must have. You believe that this is a medical necessity? I do, most certainly. About the same time, General Miles had heard from the country. The indictment had already aroused sharp criticism of the government. Stanton had come down to Fortress Monroe and peeped through the bars at the victim he was torturing and had extracted all the comfort possible from the incident. The shackles were removed. His jailer persisted in denying him the most innocent books to read. He asked the doctor to get him, if possible, the geology or the botany of the South. General Miles thought them dangerous subjects. At least the names sounded treasonable. He denied the request. The prisoner asked for his trunk and clothes. Miles decided to keep them in his own office and dole out the linen by his own standard of need. Davis turned to his physician with a flash of anger. It's contemptible that they should thus dole out my clothes as if I were a convict in some penitentiary. They mean to degrade me. It can't be done. No man can be degraded by unmerited insult heaped upon the helpless. Such acts can only degrade their perpetrators. The day will come when the people will blush at the memory of such treatment. At last, the loss of sleep proved beyond his endurance. He had tried to fight it, but gave up in a burst of passionate protest to Dr. Craven. The sight of his eye was failing. The horror of blindness chilled his soul. "My treatment here," he began with an effort at restraint, "is killing me by inches. Let them make shorter work of it. I can't sleep. No man can live without sleep. My jailers know this. I'm never alone a moment. Always the eye of a guard staring at me day and night. If I doze a feverish moment, the noise of the relieving guards sent each 2 hours wakes me, and the blazing lamps pour its glare into my aching, throbbing eyes. There must be a change, or I shall go mad, blind, or both." He paused a moment and lifted his hollow face to the physician pathetically. "Have you ever been conscious of being watched, of having an eye fixed on you every moment, scrutinizing your smallest act, the change of the muscles of your face, or the pose of your body? To have a human eye riveted on you every moment, waking, sleeping, sitting, walking, is a refinement of torture never dreamed of by a Comanche Indian. It is the eye of a spy, an enemy, gloating over the pain and humiliation which it creates. The lamp burning in my eyes is a form of torment devised by someone who knew my habit of life, never to sleep except in total darkness. When I took old Black Hawk, the Indian chief, captive to our barracks in St. Louis, I shielded him from the vulgar gaze of the curious. I've lived too long in the woods to be frightened by an owl, and I've seen death too often to flinch at any form of pain. But this torture of being forever watched is beginning to prey on my reason." The doctor's report that day was written in plain English. "I find Mr. Davis in a very critical state, his nervous debility extreme, his mind despondent, his appetite gone, complexion livid, and pulse denoting deep prostration of all vital energies. I am alarmed and anxious over the responsibility of my position. If he should die, in prison without trial, subject to such severities as have been inflicted on his attenuated frame, the world will form conclusions, and with enough color to pass them into history." Dr. Craven was getting too troublesome. General Miles dismissed him and called in Dr. George Cooper, a physician whose political opinions were supposed to be sounder. End of Chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Victim, a Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 45, The Mastermind. Sokola read the story of the chaining of the Confederate chieftain with indignation. His intimate association with Jefferson Davis had convinced him of his singular purity of character and loftiness of soul. That he was capable of conspiring to murder Abraham Lincoln was inconceivable. That the charge should be made and pressed seriously by the national government was a disgrace to the country. Charles O'Connor, the greatest lawyer in America, indignant at the outrage, had offered his services to the prisoner. Sokola hastened to a conference with O'Connor and placed him at his command. The lawyer sent him to Washington to find the mastermind at the bottom of these remarkable proceedings. "Johnson, the president," he warned, "is only a tool in the hands of a stronger man. Find that man. Stanton, the Secretary of War, is vindictive, but he lacks the cunning. Stevens, the leader of the House, is the real ruler of the nation at this moment, yet I have the most positive information that Stevens sneers at the attempt to accuse Davis of the assassination of Lincoln. Stevens hated Lincoln only a degree less than he hates Davis. He is blunt, outspoken, brutal in his views. There can be no question of the honesty of his position. Sumner, the leader of the Senate, is incapable of such low intrigue. Find the man and report to me." Sokola found him within 6 hours after his arrival in Washington. He was morally sure of him from the moment he left O'Connor's office. Immediately on his arrival at the Capitol, he sought an interview with Joseph Holt, now the Judge Advocate General of the United States Army. He was therefore in charge of the prosecution of the cases of Clay and Davis. For 5 minutes he watched the crooked, poisonous mouth of the ex-Secretary of War and knew the truth. The vindictive, venomous old man, ambitious, avaricious, implacable in his hatreds, had organized a board of assassination which he called the Bureau of Military Justice. This remarkable bureau had already murdered Mrs. Surratt on perjured testimony. Sokola had given his ex-chief no intimation of his personal feelings and no hint of his association with O'Connor. "I've a little favor to ask of you, young man." Sokola bowed. "At your service, Chief. I need a man of intelligence and skill to convey a proposition to Wirtz, the keeper of Andersonville prison. He has been sentenced to death by the Bureau of Military Justice. I'm going to offer him his life on one condition, and that is, If he will confess under oath that Davis ordered the starving and torturing of prisoners at Andersonville, I'll commute his sentence. I see. I'll give you an order to interview Wirtz. He's never seen you. Report to me his answer. When Sokola explained to Wirtz in sympathetic tones the offer of the government to spare his life for the implication of Davis in direct orders from Richmond commanding cruelties at Andersonville, the condemned man lifted his wounded body and stared at his visitor. His answer closed the interview. Tell the scoundrel who sent you that I am a soldier. I was a soldier in Germany before I cast my fortunes with the South. I bear in my body the wounds of honorable warfare. If I hadn't time to learn the meaning of honor from my friends in the South, my mother taught me in the old world. You ask me to save my life from these assassins by swearing away the life of another. Tell my executioner that I never saw the President of the Confederacy. I never received an order of any kind from him. I did the best I could for the men in my charge at Andersonville and tried honestly to improve their conditions. I am not a perjurer, even to save my own life. A soldier's business is to die. I am ready. Sokola extended his hand through the bars and grasped the prisoners. The deeper he dived into the seething mass of corruption and blind passion which had engulfed Washington, the more desperate he saw the situation of Davis at Fortress Monroe. After 2 weeks of careful work, he hurried to New York and reported the situation to O'Connor. The mastermind is Holt. The Judge Advocate General? Yes. That accounts for my inability to obtain a copy of the charges against Davis. Holt drew those charges. They are in his hands, and he is determined to press his prisoner to trial before the Board of Assassins without allowing me to know the substance of his accusation. It's infamous. There are complications which may increase dangers or suddenly lift them. Complications? What do you mean? The President, who has been intensely hostile to Davis, realizes that his own term of office and possibly his life are now at stake. He has broken with the radicals who control Congress. Old Thaddeus Stevens at their head. Stevens lives in Washington in brazen defiance of conventionalities with a Negro woman, who he separated from her husband 30-odd years ago. Under the influence of this negress, he has introduced a bill into the House of Representatives to confiscate the remaining property of the white people of the South and give it to the Negroes, dividing the land into plots of 40 acres each. He proposes also to disenfranchise the whites of the southern states, enfranchise the Negroes, destroy the state lines, and erect on their ruins territories ruled by Negroes whom his faction can control. Johnson, a southern-born white man, has already informed the radicals that he will fight this program to the last ditch. Stevens' answer was characteristic of the imperious old leader. Let them dare. I'll impeach Andrew Johnson, remove him from office, and hang him from the balcony of the White House. The President realizes that the Bureau of Military Justice, which he allowed Holt to create, may be used as the engine of his own destruction. They have already taken the first steps to impeach him. Then he'll never dare to allow another case to be tried before that Bureau, O'Connor interrupted. It remains to be seen. He is afraid of both Stanton and Holt. The Bureau of Military Justice is their hobby. O'Connor sprang to his feet. We must smash it. By an appeal to the people. Their sense of justice is yet the salt that will save the nation. The key to the situation is in the character of the remarkable witnesses whom Holt has produced before this tribunal of assassination. In my judgment, they are a gang of hired perjurers. Their leader is a fellow named Conover. There are 5 men associated with him. They use these witnesses against Mrs. Surratt. They use them against Wirtz. They are preparing to use them against Davis. It is inconceivable that these plugs from the gutters of New York could have really stumbled on the facts to which they have sworn. Find out who these men are. Get their records to the last hour of the day you track them and report to me. Sokola organized a force of detectives and sent them to work. The task was a difficult one. He found that Conover and his pals were protected by the unlimited power of the national government. End of Chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 46, The Torture. When the prisoner fought to save his reason in the dungeon at Fortress Monroe, his wife was denied the right to lift her hand in his defense. No communication was allowed between them except through his jailer. On arrival in Savannah, Mrs. Davis and her children were compelled to walk through the blazing heat, the long distance from the wharf uptown, the whole party trudging immigrant fashion through the streets. Her sister carried the baby. Mrs. Davis and the two little boys and Maggie followed with parcels, and Robert, her faithful black man, brought up the rear with baggage. The people of Savannah, on learning of their arrival, treated the prisoners with the utmost kindness. Every home in the city was thrown open to them. Her children had been robbed of all of their clothing except what they wore. The neighbors hurried in with clothes. The newspapers of Savannah of the new regime, the Republican, published and republished with gleeful comments the most sensational accounts of the brutal scene of the shackling of Davis. Maggie composed a prayer and taught it to her little brothers to repeat in concert for their grace at the table morning, noon, and night. Dear Lord, give our father something he can eat, and keep him strong, and bring him back to us with eyes that can see, and in his good senses, to his little children for Jesus' sake. Nearly every day the child who composed the prayer was so moved by its recital she would run from the table and dry her tears in the next room before she could eat. Hourly scenes of violence increased between the whites and the inflamed blacks. A Negro sentinel leveled his gun at little Jeff and threatened to shoot him for calling him uncle. With prayers and tears, the mother sent her children away to the home of a friend in Montreal. A year passed before President Johnson, in answer to the wife's desperate pleading, permitted her to visit her husband in prison. She arrived from Montreal on the cold, raw morning of May 10th, 1866, at 4 o'clock before day. There was no hotel at the fort at that time, and the mother was compelled to sit in the desolate little waiting room with her baby without a fire until 10 o'clock. General Miles called. His references to her husband were made in a manner which brutally expressed his hatred and contempt. She had been informed that his health was in so dangerous a condition that physicians had despaired of his life. Miles hastened to say, "Davis is in good health." "I can see him at once," she begged. "Yes, you understand the terms of your parole, that you are to take no deadly weapons into prison." Suppressing a smile at the unique use of language with a man of rank of Miles could make, she replied quickly, "I understand. Please arrange that I can see him at once." Without answering, the jailer turned and left the room. In a few minutes an officer appeared who conducted her to the room in Carroll Hall to which Dr. Cooper had forced Miles to remove the prisoner. Dr. Cooper proved as troublesome to the general as Dr. Craven. In fact, a little more so. He had a way of swearing when angered which made the general nervous. American physicians don't make good politicians when the life of a patient is involved. They were challenged by 3 lines of sentries, each requiring a password. Ascending a stairway, turned to the right and entered the guard room where 3 young officers were sitting. Through the bars of the inner room his wife gazed at her husband with streaming eyes. His body had shrunk to a skeleton, his eyes set and glassy, his cheekbones pressing against the shining skin. He rose and tottered across the room, his breath coming in short gasps. His voice was scarcely audible. Mrs. Davis was locked in with him. She sent the baby back to her quarters by Frederick, another faithful Negro servant who had followed their fortunes through good report and evil. His room had a horse bucket for water, a basin, and a pitcher on an old chair whose back had been sawed off, a little iron bedstead with a hard mattress, 1 pillow, a wooden table, and wooden chair with 1 leg shorter than the other, which might be used as an improvised rocker. His bed was so thick with bugs and the room filled with their odor. He was so innocent of such things he couldn't imagine what distressed him so at night, insisting that he had contracted some sort of skin disease. His dinner was slopped from one dish to another and covered by a gray hospital towel sogged with all the liquids. The man of fastidious taste glanced at the platter and saw that his good doctor's wife had added oysters to his menu that day and ate one. His vitality was so low, even this gave him intense pain. He was not bitter, but expressed his quiet contempt for the systematic petty insults which his jailer was now heaping on him daily. His physician had demanded that he take exercise in the open air. Miles always walked with him and never permitted an occasion of this kind to pass without directing at his helpless prisoner personal insults so offensive that Davis always cut his walk short to be rid of his tormentor. On one occasion, the general was so brutal in his conversation after he had locked his prisoner in his room that he suddenly sprang at the bars, grasped them with his trembling skeleton hands, and cried, "But for these, you should answer to me, here and now." A favorite pastime of his jailer was to admit crowds of vulgar sightseers and permit them to gaze at the prisoner. A woman inquired of Frederick, who was on his way to his room, "Where's Jeff?" The Negro bowed gravely and drew his stalwart figure erect. "I's sorry not to be able to tell you, madam. I don't know any such persons." "Yes, you do. Aren't you his servant?" "No, madam. You's mistaken. I's the honor to serve ex-President Davis." Only a great soul can command the love and respect of his servants, as did this quiet, grave statesman of the old regime. Never during the long hours of these weeks and months of torture did he lose his dignity or his lofty bearing quail before his tormentor. He was too refined and dignified to be abusive, and too proud in General Miles' delicate phraseology to beg. The loving wife began her now desperate fight to nurse him back to life again. The new commandant of the fort, General Burton, who replaced Miles, proved himself a gentleman and a soldier of the old school. He immediately gave to the prisoner every courtesy possible and to his wife's sympathy and help. The Bishop of Montreal sent him a case of green chartreuse from his own stores. The powerful digestive stimulant helped his feeble appetite to take the nourishment needed to sustain life and slowly build his strength. He could sleep only when read to, and many a day dawned on the worn figure of his wife, still droning her voice into his sensitive ears with one hand on his pulse, praying God it might still beat. At times it stopped, and then she roused the sleeper, gave him the stimulant, and made him eat something which she always kept ready. Dr. Cooper had warned that the walls of his heart were so weak, even a sound sleep might prove his death if too long continued. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 47, Vindication. When Sokola had finished his work developing the history and character of Conover and his crew of professional perjurers, there was a sudden collapse in the machinery of the Bureau of Military Justice. Holt was compelled not only to repudiate the wretches by whose hired testimony he had committed more than one murder through the forms of military law, but also to issue a long document defending himself as a Judge Advocate General of the United States from the charge of subordination and perjury, the vilest accusation that can be brought against a sworn officer of any court. His weak defense served its purpose for the moment. He managed to cling to his office and his salary for a brief season. With the advent of restored law, he sank into merited oblivion. The charge of murder having collapsed, the government now pressed against Davis an indictment for treason. Salmon P. Chase, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, warned the President and his cabinet that no such charge could be sustained. And still, malice held the Confederate chieftain a prisoner. Every other leader of the South had long since been released. On the public exposure of Holt and his perjurers, the conscience of the North, led by Horace Greeley and Gerrit Smith, demanded the speedy trial or release of Davis. The radical conspirators at Washington, under the leadership of Stevens, inspired by his dusky companion, were now pressing with feverish haste their program of revolution. They passed each measure over the veto of the president amid jeers, groans, and curses. They disenfranchised 1/3 of the whites of the South, gave the ballot to 1,000,000 ignorant Negroes who but yesterday, taken from the jungles of Africa, blotted out the civil government of the southern states and sent in the army back to enforce their decrees. Stevens introduced his bill to confiscate the property of the whites and give it to the Negroes. This measure was his pet. It was the only one of his schemes which would be defeated on a 2/3 vote if Johnson could veto it. Stevens and Butler at once drew their bill of indictment against the president and set in motion the machinery to remove him from office, the grim old leader still swearing that he would hang him. In this auspicious moment, Charles O'Connor marshaled his forces and demanded the release of Davis on bail. Andrew Johnson had seen a new light. He was now in a life-and-death struggle with the newly enthroned mob to save the Republic from a dictatorship. The conspirators had already selected the man they proposed to set up on his removal from office. The president issued an order to General Burton at Fortress Monroe to produce his prisoner in the United States District Court at Richmond. On May 4th, 1867, the little steamer from the fort touched the wharf at Richmond, and Jefferson Davis and his wife once more appeared in the capital of the Confederacy. The South had come to greet them. All differences of opinion were stilled before the white face of the man who had been put in irons for their sins. They came from the four corners of the country for which he had toiled and suffered. Senator Barton, his wife and daughter, and all his surviving sons had come from Fairview to do him honor. A vast crowd assembled at the wharf. No king ever entered his palace with grander welcome. The road from the wharf to the Spotswood Hotel was a living sea of humanity. His carriage couldn't move until the ways were forced open by mounted police. The windows and roofs of every house were crowded. Men and women everywhere were in tears. As the carriage turned into Main Street, a man shouted, "Hats off, Virginians!" Every head was bared in the vast throng which stretched a mile through the thoroughfare. As he passed in triumph, the people for whom he had worked and suffered crowded to his carriage, stretched out their hands in silence, and touched his garments while the tears rolled down their cheeks. They arranged for him a trial on the charge of high treason. The indictment had also named Robert E. Lee as guilty of the same crime. Grant lifted his mailed fist and told the government he would fight if necessary to protect the man who had surrendered in good faith to his army. The peanut politicians dropped Lee's name. When the tall, emaciated leader of the South stood erect before his accusers in court, he faced a scene which proclaimed the advent of the new democracy in America, which must yet make good its right to live. On the judge's bench sat John C. Underwood, a crawling, shambling, shuffling, ignorant demagogue who had set a new standard of judicial honor and dignity. He had selected one of the handsomest homes in Virginia, ordered it confiscated as a federal judge, and made his wife buy it in and convey it to him after warning other bidders to keep off the scene. The thief was living in his stolen mansion on the day he sat down beside the Chief Justice of the United States in this trial. When Chase had warned the government that no charge of treason could stand against Davis, Underwood assured the Attorney General that he would fix a Negro jury in Richmond, which could be relied on to give the verdict necessary. He had impaneled the first grand jury ever assembled in America, composed of Negroes and whites. A Negro petit jury now sat in the box, grinning at the judge, their thick lips, flat noses, and omnipotent African odor proclaiming the dawn of a new era in the history of America. Salmon P. Chase, with quiet dignity, voted to quash the indictment. Underwood, with a vulgar stump speech to his crowd of Negroes, voted to hold the indictment good. The case was sent to the Supreme Court on this disagreement, and the defendant admitted to bail. Horace Greeley and Garrett Smith, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and August Schell, representing the noblest spirit in the North, were among the men who signed his bail bond. When he was released and walked out of the courtroom, cheer after cheer swept the struggling crowd that greeted him. Senator Barton took the driver's place in the box, while thousands followed him to the hotel shouting themselves hoarse. For 3 hours he stood shaking the hands of weeping men and women. No sublimer tribute was ever paid to human worth. It came with healing to his wounded soul. The anguish of the past was if it had never been. Jenny Barton gazed with astonishment when Sokola grasped his outstretched hand. She was standing near enough to hear his voice. "I want to thank you, young man, for all that you have done for me and mine. Mr. O'Connor tells me that your services have been invaluable for myself, my wife and babies, and my people. I thank you again. I wish I might do something to repay you." "I've only done my duty," was the modest response, "but I think you can help me with a little, if it's within my power. You remember Miss Barton? I've just shaken hands with her. She's here. Would you mind putting in a word?" "I'll do more, sir. I'm in command today. I'll issue positive orders." Jenny moved. He saw her and beckoned. She came blushing. "What's this, my little comrade?" he whispered, seizing her hands. "The war's over. I've shaken hands with Horace Greeley and Garrett Smith today. There can be no stragglers in our camp. I owe my life to this young man." He took Jenny's hand, placed it on Sokola's arm, and he led her silent and blushing from the crowd to an alcove in the far corner of the hall. She looked up into his face with tenderness. "You've done a noble and beautiful thing in the gift of your life to our chief for these 2 miserable years." "They've been miserable to you." She smiled. "But I knew you would come." "You'll not send me away again." She slowly slipped her arms around his neck and kissed him. They stood on the balcony hand in hand and watched the crowds surging about the carriage as the tall chieftain left the hotel to take the train to greet his children. Sokola uncovered his head and spoke reverently. He belongs to the race of giants who have made our nation what it is today. We owe a debt to the unflinching dignity and honesty of his mind. He made hedging, trimming, and compromise impossible, the issues which divided us of life and death. A weaker man would have wavered, and we should have had to fight our battles over again. They have been settled for all time. Jenny lifted her eyes to his. What's your name, my sweetheart? He laughed. Does it matter now? Our country's won. My name is Love. The End of the Victim. A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis.